Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for another edition of the most disruptive show in American news and politics, as well as global news and politics. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, going into headlines this morning. First up in COVID news, at least 4,101 new coronavirus deaths and 155,470 new cases were reported yesterday in the U.S. Over the past week, there has been an average of 163,159 cases per day. That's a decrease of 34% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Thursday morning, more than 25,640,200 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and at least 429,312 have died from it. Yesterday, Colombian President Iván Duque announced Colombia has suspended air traffic with Brazil for a month over the spread of a new strain of the coronavirus in Brazil. Peru has announced new lockdowns for 10 of its 25 regions, including the capital Lima, as COVID-19 cases rise and hospitals reach a breaking point. The lockdowns will start on January 31st. A rural Georgia medical center has been suspended from the state's COVID-19 vaccination program for 6 months after the facility administered vaccines to staff at the local school district. In New Jersey, the Hunterdon Medical Center, a hospital, has been accused of allowing wealthy donors, executives, and their relatives to skip the COVID-19 vaccine line, giving them their shots when only frontline healthcare workers and nursing home residents were eligible. The group includes the hospital's CEO, his wife, other execs, their spouses, and kids. Jamarl, what's your take on that one?
You mean giving it in advance? I mean, it depends on whether it was going to go bad. I mean, they're basically, like I said with the guy yesterday, the paramedic who was basically stealing doses. The punitive aspect of this is going to come from the, how popular it is, how necessary it is. And so, yeah, there are going to be consequences if these guys are going to be given the stuff in lieu of the way it's supposed to be administered. I got to be honest, for something like this, that's on some level to be understood, it's like selling water for $1,000 in a drought. Yeah, if they're going to go around the edges, that's going to be somewhat of a problem. Allowing wealthy donors and their relatives to skip the COVID vaccine line, yeah, that's not going to be allowed. That's going to be punished big time. That is going to be punished.
It will be.
Hospital CEO, his wife, his other executives. Because the reality is, 42% of the public was making $18,000 before COVID. And those people, the people who got, running on a hamster wheel, the people without $500 in the bank, those are the people that got hit the most. And on top of it, the people with higher incomes were able to basically go into their enclaves and wait it out. They could build their fortress and they could still collect their cash because they weren't the ones that needed to be in office to do their jobs. It was the frontline workers, the people who took the hit for everybody else, who doesn't get the good pay, who doesn't get any of that stuff. Those are the people who took the hit. And honestly, they should be the ones who get it first. CEO, his wife, and other executives, there should be serious consequences for this.
All right, next headline here. Hundreds of Holocaust survivors in Austria and Slovakia got their first dose of a coronavirus vaccine Wednesday. That as an acknowledgement of past suffering and a tribute to resilience 76 years after Soviet troops liberated the Auschwitz death camp in Nazi-occupied Poland. More than 1,000 Columbia University students are withholding this semester's tuition as they demand that the Ivy League school in New York City lower its cost amid financial burdens and the move to online classes prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic, accusing the school of demonstrating a flagrant disregard for initiatives democratically supported within the community. The striking students are asking the school to lower tuition by at least 10% and to increase financial aid. The letter also asks the school to end its expansion into and gentrification of West Harlem, defund its university police force, and bargain in good faith with campus unions. The World Health Organization is refusing to confirm whether the coronavirus originated in China as President Biden strengthens his administration's ties with the entity. President Biden has promised to overturn President Donald Trump's decision in June to cut off funds to the World Health Organization and withdraw the U.S. from that agency. The WHO, by the way, sent a task force, which as far as I know is still working to determine the origin of COVID, the origins of the coronavirus. Again, as far as I can tell, it would still be too early for them to have come back conclusively with a response. But we'll see about that. In national political news, yesterday, U.S. President Joe Biden has signed a series of executive orders designed to address climate change, including a new ban on some energy drilling. The orders aim to freeze new oil and gas leases on public lands and double offshore wind-produced energy by 2030. They are expected to meet stiff resistance from the energy industry and come as a sea change from Donald Trump, who cut environmental protections across the board. Today is Climate Day at the White House. That was according to Mr. Biden yesterday. We've already waited too long, he told reporters, and we can't wait any longer. The series of executive orders that President Biden signed on Wednesday establishes a White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy and announces a summit of leaders to be held in April on Earth Day. Climate change under Biden's plan will become both a national security and foreign policy priority, officials say. A former attorney for the Cuban American Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio told a court hearing that in 2014, the right-wing group's leader was an FBI informant and helped federal authorities bust marijuana growing operations, gambling houses, and human trafficking rings in Florida after he was arrested in 2012. Tarrio has denied the claims. What do you think of that, Jamarl? That's just very interesting.
I thought that was really interesting. I thought that was really interesting. I have it saved in my queue, by the way. This was going to be one of the stories I talk about. That's fascinating. I mean, what does that do to his reputation? And if you're looking for a way to basically, let's say, undercut or subvert that action or that group, oh man, that's the way to do it. That's big. That's going to cause serious consternation.
And he's denying it. That's a weird thing. His attorneys are saying this, and he's denying it. Anyway, Chicago City Council voted Wednesday to designate the home where Emmett Till lived before his brutal death as a landmark. The Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley House, located in the city's Woodlawn neighborhood, will now be converted into a museum. In international political news, President Joe Biden's nominee for the post of U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, revealed during her confirmation hearing in the Senate that the Department of State is reviewing the possibility of designating the actions of the Chinese authorities in the Xinjiang region as quote-unquote genocide and crimes against humanity. Needless to say, the Chinese state does not particularly like the prospect of that. A little bit less than 2 years ago, we basically set up a sanctions regime by which we began to sanction certain people, certain entities for what we believe they're doing on a large scale in the Xinjiang region with the Uyghurs. To the extent that we continue those policies, to the extent that we extend them, and if we follow through on the Pompeo-style, anti-China doctrine, I don't see how we're going to have any resumption of peaceful relations with China, which many are saying the Biden regime, the Biden presidency, desperately wants. I'm not sure how desperate they are in their wanting of that. But Jamarl, this is an ongoing thing. Pompeo labeled the Chinese state a genocidal state, effectively, basically the day before Trump left the White House. And in the process, he set the Biden administration up to, figure out how they want to handle that. Do they want to revoke that? Do they want to roll that back and in the process come under pressure from Republicans as China sympathizers or whatever? Or do they want to continue that trend? How are they going to deal with that? What's your take? How should they deal with that, Jamarl?
I wouldn't go with the idea of calling China basically, committing genocide. I wouldn't start there. That's the truth, nor would I rely on the word of Mike Pompeo, who basically screamed to a crowd that he lied, cheated, and stole, and even got positive affirmation with applause afterwards. So Pompeo wouldn't necessarily be my guiding star for any level of truth. I wouldn't trust him as far as I can, throw him. That said, from the standpoint of Joe Biden coming into office, it is possible that Joe Biden used some of the things of the Trump administration for his own political wins. Meaning, you don't do everything or change everything over, especially if you are in some level of competition with a particular opponent and you want to extract something of it, using the ogre that came before you as a way of doing that. So, look, I've heard an argument that Joe Biden is going to be far more conciliatory with China. I would say this is not the way to do it. And at this point, we have a multipolar world. And whatever you think of China, we in this country, especially political leaders, consider it competition. But there are two ways you can do with it. You can be antagonistic, or you could work with them in a cooperative way. The cooperative way seems to be off the table. And the hope is that Joe Biden doesn't go the route that Trump went with this, even though he's going to carve his own pathway out to try to compete. I guarantee you. The TPP was one that the Obama administration was trying. I don't think Biden is going to try to rebuild that. Who knows? But that was the way that the Obama administration was trying to deal with China. Trump becomes blunt. And so he tries to deal with them by, calling them names. The Chinese are killing this person or that person. The Chinese are scamming us. They're cheating, et cetera, et cetera. That's the way Trump will with it. I'm going to pass sanctions. Well, those sanctions end up hurting a lot of people who back Donald Trump. And so hopefully Biden goes with a different path. I think there is a such thing as win-win outcomes. I just don't think the people in power believe that.
All right, we got to move on. We could keep talking about that, but more headlines here. The Polish government has imposed a near total ban on abortions, including the termination of pregnancies with fetal defects, delivering a major blow to pro-choice advocates in one of Europe's most devout Catholic countries. The unexpected announcement that the ruling would take effect on Wednesday sparked nationwide protests, with demonstrators gathering in front of the ruling Law and Justice Party's offices. Yesterday in the UK, government ministers voted 363 to 267 to reverse the House of Lords' October bill called Cover Human Intelligence Sources Bill, which was proposed as an effort to explicitly ban Downing Street from giving immunity to undercover agents who committed serious criminal offenses, including potentially murder and rape, while they were part of operations. Russian authorities on Thursday detained several allies of opposition leader Alexei Navalny and issued warnings to social media giants. This after tens of thousands of people took to the streets in over 100 Russian cities last weekend to demand his release. Detainees were held for 48 hours as part of a criminal probe into alleged violations of coronavirus regulations during the weekend's protests. Today in Germany, a far-right extremist, 47-year-old Stefan Ernst, was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the June 1st, 2019 murder of Walter Lübcke, a member of Chancellor Angela Merkel's party who led the regional administration in the Kassel area of central Germany. Lübcke was targeted because he had been outspoken in favor of helping refugees. Prosecutors said Ernst had attended a 2015 town hall event where the politician had defended the German government's decision to allow hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers into the country. Ernst shot Lübcke on the politician's porch, and he died hours later. Pakistan's Supreme Court on Thursday ordered the release of Ahmad Saeed Omar Sheikh, a Pakistani man convicted of the gruesome beheading of American journalist Daniel Pearl in 2002. An appeal of the acquittal by Pearl's family was dismissed. The court also ordered 3 other Pakistanis, also part of Pearl's kidnapping and death, to be freed. Pearl disappeared on January 23rd, just a couple of days ago, while investigating militant links to the so-called shoe bomber. His body was discovered in a shallow grave soon after a gruesome video of his beheading was delivered to the U.S. consulate in Karachi. In a tech headline here, after imposing the temporary restrictions on political advertising ahead of the 2020 presidential elections, yesterday, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg announced that his company will stop promoting political groups and like content to users permanently. Zuckerberg added that Facebook is now considering further measures to reduce the amount of political content that users read in their newsfeed. We could talk about that. I've got more headlines, but I'm interested in that one. In Earth and Science news, scientists at Moscow's National University of Science and Technology have managed, in cooperation with their French colleagues, to increase by 7 times the strength of titanium and stainless steel products. According to the authors of the study, they have succeeded for the first time to combine 2 metalworking techniques that were considered incompatible and thereby achieved a dramatic improvement in material properties. That's cool. In business news, the stock value of Gamestop has soared more than 300% in the past week, with the price at the moment of writing standing at $347. GameStop jump at as much as 1,700% in 2 weeks. Fund investors who are shorting the stock lost billions, all apparently at the behest of a Reddit forum called Wall Street Bets. We got to talk about this. We're going to be talking about this more, in fact, later on in the show. I find this story to be hilarious, but also politically significant. Our last headline this morning, Boeing President and CEO Dave Calhoun revealed to company employees on Wednesday that the Boeing 777X jetliner, originally slated to debut in 2019, will not be released until late 2023 due to multiple factors, including, quote, an updated assessment of global certification requirements, our latest assessment of COVID-19 impacts on market demand, and discussions with customers with respect to aircraft delivery timing, end quote. That last bit's a bit self-referential. Anyway, we need to go into a break. Those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And on the other side of this break, we'll be back with our soapbox segment and Jamarl Thomas's monologue. Again, we got a great show coming up. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan. Be right back in about a minute.
Fault Lines.
So Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio and video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So, Gamestop. This story has to be discussed because this story is utterly phenomenal. Basically, think of it this way. Under normal circumstances, you have market manipulation by, let's say, like hedge funds. These big time, the billionaires, the millionaires, the people who can drop huge amounts of money into a particular stock. And in doing so, move the needle. Moreover, going on television and tell people that they're buying this particular stock. And again, moving the needle. You have situations where people will short a stock and then they will come out and say, hey, just in case anybody was interested, we're shorting this stock. And they would tell it on CNBC or whatever media platform. They would write it in whatever particular media platform. And what is going to invariably happen the moment that a large buyer said they're shorting a stock? Well, hey, there must be something wrong with the stock. Hey, maybe that stock is going to take a hit. And what happens? The stock invariably falls. Is that manipulating the market? Do they know when they go out and tell people that they're shorting the stock, that the stock is going to go down? Is this a tried and true method of making a bunch of money as a hedge fund by basically pumping and dumping a stock? The answer is yes. And under normal circumstances, the small-time buyers, the people with a few $100, maybe a few $1,000, that follow in their coattails, to the good or to their detriment. What about Congress buying stock? Is that also issues of market manipulation? Say, for example, I don't know, Perdue and Loeffler, the two losers in Georgia that were basically caught after a COVID briefing, going back and changing over their stocks, dumping some of the ones that will be adversely affected and picking up some of the ones that will be better. Is that market manipulation? And what I mean by that is having this inside information that allows people to put large positions on to take large positions on various stocks based on information that they get in their role in Congress. What about Nancy Pelosi dumping a bunch of money into Tesla, or her husband, dumping a bunch of money into Tesla while Pelosi advocates for climate change and will likely pass legislation for climate change that will be to the betterment of her portfolio, especially on this issue of batteries and on this issue of cars, meaning driverless or solar power cars. Not solar power, electric vehicles. I'm trying to make or ask the question that are these things market manipulation? And yet, these things are allowed. They are market manipulation, but they're done by basically the wealth of the nation. 80% of the stocks are owned by the top 10% of the population. So the people who basically play in the stock market are mostly people with means, but not always. Not always. This brings us to Reddit. Now, my wife loves this site called Robinhood. Robinhood allows people to basically buy small amounts of stocks. It also has a huge population that people talk and, discuss stocks and everything else. Small-time buyers. And yet, cobbled together, they become allowed. Same thing with Reddit, right? So Reddit has a group called Wall Street Bets. Wall Street Bets was talking about the various items and, that were up for discussion, but they got on this issue of retail. Now, retail, as you could think, is somewhat of a dying industry, right? It depends on the retail, but not even before COVID. You had situations like Tower Records going belly up, or Peaches Music used to be a place going belly up, meaning things that you can get online makes it difficult for brick and mortar stores. It is easy for me to go onto Steam and download a video game. Easy. I don't have to get out of my car anymore. I don't have to drive to a store anymore. And so the question becomes, how does brick and mortar survive in a situation or an adverse climate because of tech, but also because of COVID? 40% of retail closed up? And it closed up because basically some of the businesses weren't allowed to open. If you weren't a store, if you weren't serving food or something to that effect, you weren't going to open, which was going to put pressure on your bottom line. Meaning retail was already suffering. COVID made it worse. Enter Wall Street Bets. Now, Wall Street Bets, basically in this kind of back and forth, came up with the conclusion of saying, hey, all of those people who are shorting GameStop. Now, by short, it means under normal circumstances, you can buy a stock. And if that stock goes up in value, you gain a bunch of money. But there's some people that buy stocks with the idea of that stock going down in value where they can sell it and make money. Now, what does this do to a stock? If you have a large number of people who are betting that the stock falls, let's say, for example, retail, oftentimes that stock falls. Oftentimes they're able to eat that stock alive, make a ton of money off of basically destroying a company. Wall Street Bets, small-time buyers, there are about 2 million people in the group, say, hey, let's buy a bunch of GameStop. And in buying a bunch of GameStop, let's stick it to the oligarchs, the plutocrats of the world. Now, I don't know if they went that far into it, of sticking it to the plutocrats, but they did take issue with the idea of these guys destroying brick and mortar. And they, to get them back, decided to buy GameStop. Now, to get this across on how fantastic this is, these guys have gotten to the point where Melvin Capital, one of the main companies that was invested in this way, took this huge position in short selling. By the way, not the only one to do it. They lost billions. They were losing $1 billion a day. Yesterday alone, they lost $14.3 billion. And the reason they lost it is because they had to make do on their bets. Meaning you can't just short forever. And there's money that you have to pay even in the context of shorting, meaning they had to carry those positions, adding more and more money as GameStop skyrocketed. A $20 stock jumped to like $300. Let me repeat that. A $20 stock jumped to like $300 in no time. Their line is going straight up. Now, I have no issue with this. The market, oligarchs, plutocrats often manipulate the market. That is normal, fair. And so to see a situation like this where a little guy says, hey, let's get some of these dollars and let's deliver a comeuppance to the various people in this country taking advantage during the crisis. So now what happens? The server, CNBC, goes out and cries relentlessly. In fact, let's play a clip. Let's hear billionaire tears. Let's play this clip.
We talked, we've mentioned social media. I couldn't help but, it's not obviously similar to some of this controversy surrounding Facebook and Twitter and everything else. But once again, what's one of the things that we're talking about is maybe misinformation and pump and dumps, and it's occurring on social media again. It just, I'm wondering whether it's part of the same problem, the type of regulation that we finally need to consider. And like I said, we should always have a light touch with regulation, but you're seeing the way things can get started. Again, this is different. Maybe it's Reddit, maybe it's not Facebook, but you're seeing the same situation. At this point, it's not about an election. It's not about an insurrection, but there are interesting things happening that seem to be spawned to some extent.
Let's stop right there for a moment. Let's stop right there for the moment. This gentleman on Financial Channel is basically asking, maybe we need regulation. Maybe we need regulation. When have you ever heard somebody representing Wall Street scream for regulation in this way? And understand why they're doing it. It's because these little guys on Wall Street bets, basically, they lost their shirts and they are on the air crying. I've never seen so many oligarchs cry. It's phenomenal. Even foreign powers. Let's hear this clip. Let's play this clip.
That's the kid where Ryan Cohen got in. He bought 15% at $8. He's on the board. We like the stock. How is that bad? Or do you think that they're concentrated and doing some sort of manipulation if they say they like the stock?
Well, I don't know if they're concentrated because I don't have subpoena power and I can't really go out and look at it. I can argue. I don't even know if there are foreign powers at work here behind the scenes trying to make chaos of our market.
I don't know if there are foreign powers trying to make chaos of our markets. Think about that. This is the mantra that Democrats have gone with so long, and Trump, and now these guys are basically saying, I think these guys are being manipulated by some foreign power. Nonsense.
But then to his credit, then the other dude was like, will you stop immediately?
Yeah, because it was nonsense. Jim Cramer was like, cut it out, because it's nonsense. Just to put a nice bow on this, to end this, the Reddit site was shut down. Now, they make the argument that there were some things on that site that were unseemly, and so they had to shut it down, saying that it had nothing to do with the fact that billionaires lost their shirt. I'm going to say BS on that, and I'm going to say it is exactly because of the fact billionaires lost their shirts and was crying all day yesterday. Insane.
Wait, it's still up. Jamarl, we might be talking about slightly different things, but if I go to reddit.com/r/Wall Street Bets, it is up. There are 4.4 million people on it. They've quickly changed their branding, and now they're all pro-Trump and stuff.
Because they sent out a message yesterday, literally, that they shut it down, and they had to be explicit saying they didn't shut it down for the explicit, right here. The server has been on our trust safety team's radar for some time due to the occasion content that violates community guidelines, including hate speech, glorifying violence, spreading misinformation. Over the past few months, we have issued multiple warnings to the server admin. Today, we decided to remove the server and its owner from Discord for continuing allowed hateful and discriminatory content after repeated warnings. Now, unless I'm missing something, unless there are multiple servers that this particular thing is on. So that might be fair. But I guess I'm making the point that they shut this down under this idea of there's content on here that we don't particularly like. And it just so happened to happen immediately after these guys stuck it to the market. Astonishing. Utterly astonishing. But we can come back to this one. I mean, we could talk about it in the next at the 8:15 break. You guys are listening. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Dr. Piers Robinson. He is a political scientist and the co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. You can follow him, by the way, on Twitter, Piers Robinson1. Also check out his blog, piersrobinson.wordpress.com. Dr. Robinson, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing very well.
Very glad to have you. Last time we had you on, we had a sort of wide-ranging conversation about the nature of propaganda. And while I don't want to have that exact same conversation again, I do want to get into that topic, looking at it from a kind of high level, because the last couple of weeks have been portentous of what's to come, I would say, with a Biden presidency. Or after, in the States, after what happened on January 6th, there was a quick and pretty much universal condemnation of not only the events themselves, but of basically everybody at the scene of the events, as well as Donald Trump, and to some extent, other Republican Party more widely. And of course, that would come along with a condemnation of the Republican base in a lot of cases. So on the other side of that condemnation, you're hearing now increasingly vocal cries for the suppression, the control of quote unquote domestic terrorism, a sort of ambiguously defined and easily extendable term, which could be used increasingly against, more and more folks. And I'm curious, looking at that term through the lens of somebody who tries to understand propaganda, I'm curious about your perspective of this as a person, but also as somebody who studies this stuff. How would a term like that be used? What's the point of not coining it, but of using it increasingly often to describe people of all political stripes coming from all political backgrounds? I'm kind of putting my bias into it a little bit, Dr. Robinson, but I'm curious, what's yours? What's your take?
Well, my reading of what's going on in the States, and to a lesser extent across many European countries, is that the language of the war on terror, as it were, and the language of countering extremism is now really taking hold across people in government.
Do you believe that this is one of those things that is going to... Well, let me ask you this. What do you think the outcome of this is going to be? Like, is there going to be a corrective? Is there... I guess because what it looks like, it's hard to tell whether or not this is a censorship thing because they're concerned about issues of power, or whether or not this is, let's say, good faith. And even if it's good faith, at some point, it's going to go too far, at least in my estimate. Do you see that happening already, or is that one of those things that is just kind of building up? We're just at the beginning of this.
Yeah, it seems like we lost him. He had a kind of clipped response earlier, and it seems like his audio cut out or something. We might be, hey, we're talking about propaganda, and suddenly the conversation drops out, just pointing it out, not really saying something actually happened there, but, the connection there is pretty sensible to folks. Anyway, we're trying to get Dr. Piers Robinson back on.
Yeah, that's so weird. I thought that was me. I was like, is that me? Is that my system? What's going on? Hopefully we could get it back, because this is a really good conversation. And by the way, I looked up the Discord thing again. They were shut down for a while
on Discord.
Yeah, and eventually they came back on. They were shut down to private, and they eventually came back on. But that brings up this point too: the thing of trying to silence a group using the idea of this notion of, okay, these guys are saying something we don't particularly like, as the fig leaf to get rid of it.
Well, but I mean, here's the thing, and this is admittedly, I don't mean to just parrot them, but this is what the some of the leading members of the Wall Street Bets subreddit were saying. You get 150,000 people, 250,000 people, whatever the count is, in the Discord.
2 million.
You have millions of active users
2 million.
on the subreddit.
2 million.
Oh, there you go. Thank you. You got 4.4 million people on their subreddit. So you have a huge number of people. Just literally a law of large numbers. Statistically, you're going to get a bunch of people spewing vile stuff, but that happens. That comes along with the scale, and it's increasingly difficult to moderate that. I don't want to defend them because I don't know exactly what was saying, who was saying what, but still, is that actually grounds for shutting down an entire community's right to speech, or is the argument then that they didn't do a good enough job at handling people's speech, at moderating their own, and therefore they should be shut down because they're not doing a good enough job at it? You know what I mean? But wouldn't that just shut off communities beyond any size?
Yes.
Once you get to a certain point, it becomes more and more difficult to moderate what's going on. You need to have like thousands of active users who are skilled at what they're doing and coordinated enough and are, using standards, but not too heavily handed to completely shut down the speech. Doesn't that just shut off discourse above a certain level at any point?
Yeah, by definition it would. Because at some point you're always going to have some people in a particular group that are going to say things that are off the wall. In fact, I would go further. When you're looking at like laws, or you're looking at, let's say, rules and regulations within context of companies, sometimes those laws are there to give the company discretion, or to give the government discretion to put you in jail or to get rid of you. It's selective in a certain way. It's, all right, we know that people are going to trespass on this, but by the same token, we're going to lock these people up, or we're going to go after them with legal consequences if they do X. I think this is something similar, where it's one of those things where you can't police that. And because you can't police it, well, you're automatically going to run afoul of it, and they can pick and choose who they want to get rid of when they run afoul of it. Piers, you're back. Welcome back to the show, Dr. Piers Robinson. Can you hear us okay?
Yeah, I'm back. It looks like I was censored, maybe.
Fair enough. We were getting into this issue of propaganda. I would like you to finish your comment. Shane, if you want to re-ask the question, you can re-ask it.
Well, I think you heard pretty much all of it, and you were setting up to respond. But basically, with the Biden administration coming in with a sort of media-given mandate to respond to, a wave of domestic terrorism. That's the charge here. It's an ambiguous term that can easily be, the boundaries of it, the definition of what it means to be a domestic terrorist can be shifted continuously. The fear is until it is used to suppress genuine speech, which goes against the establishment in certain ways, but nevertheless shouldn't qualify as domestic terrorism. So from this is a propagandist's wet dream in some sense. If what you're wanting to do with your propaganda is effectively curtail the rights to free speech of Americans and people around the world. Piers, that's the sort of setup in a broad sense. That's my take on it. What's yours?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure where you lost me and on what part of my answer, but I essentially agree with that. This is the problem with using the language of terrorism and using the language of extremism in order to justify restrictions and controls on people. And we saw this after the war on terror, and we saw it with George Bush saying, you're either with us or against us. And in Britain, this mutated into the PREVENT program, which categorizes extremism, associates extreme views with terrorism, and these are separate things. And what that ultimately does is that it becomes abused and used as a political tool to limit dissent. So people whose views are challenging, for example, U.S. foreign policy in a fundamental way, can be readily presented as sort of implicitly supportive of terrorism or as extremists, and you can then act to silence them. And I think the last thing I said after I'd been cut off was that there are increasingly coercive approaches now to limiting debate and conversation within the public sphere, both in America and throughout Europe. And this is ultimately extremely dangerous and bad for democracy and for the health of the public sphere. And we seem to be going very, very fast down that road of censorship and so on at the moment.
I'm curious, how does this match up with propaganda efforts in the past? And more importantly, is propaganda in and of itself as a flat fact absolute wrong?
Well, I think what we're seeing today is different and worse than before. In some ways, it is a continuation of what we've seen throughout the Cold War era. I suppose historically, you can look back to the McCarthy era and McCarthyism as kind of being the most recent occurrence in American history where you have this very aggressive bullying approach towards dissenting views and so on. And of course, in that case, the fear of communism was exploited in order to try to limit political debate. What we have today seems to be an intensification of that, and it seems to be much, much worse than it has been in earlier phases. And we're seeing now, for the first time, as we've seen the tech giants removing people, closing down accounts. We're seeing, I've seen in the UK, there's just talk within the political classes of the need to directly censor views, for example, in relation to COVID-19 and the views of scientists who challenge some of the responses there have been to date. And this is really sort of moving sort of away from sort of gentle, mild propaganda into quite severe censorship. On your point about is propaganda ever justified, I think one can make the case that in certain circumstances, if you need to do so in order to save lives or protect a country from attack, that levels of propaganda might be seen as justified and necessary in exceptional circumstances, but not as part and parcel of democratic life. If you have suppression and censorship going on within normal democratic politics, and you no longer have a functioning democracy. You're not allowing all views to be considered and aired, and you always, in the classic formulation of the justification for free speech, you always run the risk of censoring or excluding ideas which might be right, or arguments which might ultimately turn out to be the correct ones. As soon as you censor, as soon as you engage in that form of propaganda, sort of aggressive censoring propaganda, then you're no longer functioning as a democracy.
And how do you see the rise of, and I would say the subsequent recent decline of communication power on the internet? How does that relate to this push, or specifically a more algorithmically determined variant of propaganda, but just more generally? It seems like the level of propaganda, the degree to which the establishment is trying to indict and quickly level what they call misinformation, it seems like that's more prevalent than ever. And it seems like that was a response to the internet. But now, of course, the internet has effectively become a less and less free platform for sharing information. Is it that simple? Is it that the internet at one point posed an opportunity and that opportunity has been suppressed? What's your take on that? Piers, we've got about a minute and a half before we go into our break, by the way.
Oh, okay. I think it's certainly correct that the internet created opportunities. And as those opportunities emerged, then I think government, states, and other powerful actors have then sought to try to rein in that control. I mean, there was a comment that was made that all new communication technology has radical implications. It can sort of invigorate and not radicalize, but it can invigorate political debate. But most, as new technologies come in, political power tends to subvert their radical potential. And you see this with the internet now, and you see it very clearly with the attempts to censor and control it. It does have potential. And I think in many ways, because people are finding out the truth about many, many issues in society and in the world, powers that be do not want people to know these things, and that's probably driving this crackdown more than anything else. My own
gone again.
And it seems like we lost him again. Yeah, I was wondering. It's sad, man. It's always sudden. You know what? Piers, I'm sorry, man. That cut you out. The exact same thing happened again. I can hear you just came back in, but the timing is now such that we should go into a break. For those listening, we are joined occasionally, sadly, by Piers Robinson. He's a political scientist and the co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies, having an interesting conversation about the nature of propaganda generally and in the U.S. We've been talking about the past, but I'm curious, probably going to turn to talk about the future a little bit more in the next segment. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. But joining us is Dr. Piers Robinson, political scientist and co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. Again, Dr. Robinson, welcome back to the show.
Gone.
You say he's gone? Oh, can you hear me?
Sadly, he seems to be back offline.
Okay, that's unfortunate. It's a really interesting conversation, especially on the issue of propaganda. I mean, you and I have talked about it before, whether or not it's one of those things you can ever get rid of in a society, especially a democratic society. Meaning, if you're not using the repression of the state, meaning from the standpoint of brute force under normal circumstances in order to put down dissent, then these societies evolve a different way of doing that. And oftentimes that's by going with the narrative. And this narrative versus another one from outside of the country. And so it's like, is it possible to get away from it? And I think it's one of those things where as long as you do, or as long as you don't use your freedom to do what we don't want you to do, you can have those freedoms. It's like a forced choice almost. But the moment that you use it or exert it, at that point, it's going to be ripped away. I think it's something like it falls into that guidelines with way we engage. And so that's unfortunate. He's back. Excellent. Dr. Piers, welcome back. Just a few hiccups on, but that's not a big deal. We can keep it moving. So one of the questions on propaganda that we often get to, like I asked you before, was that something that's necessary in regards to society? And when you're looking at like political parties, especially in democratic societies, they need, to my mind, they utilize propaganda as a way to kind of organize a thought of their group or their party or something to that effect. From the standpoint of the public and from the standpoint of people that want to make a change, how do they go about that? Now, what I mean by that is because government seems so huge. It seems one of those things like it's difficult and unwieldy to manage. It seems like the opinions that people have don't necessarily register in a political space. And I would argue that feeling of alienation or that feeling that there's not a shared interest that I think is crucial and necessary in a democracy, I don't think it's necessarily there. So from the standpoint of a public that wants to change this, how do they go about it? Because I know a lot of people feel dispirited and depowered.
Well, that's a very big question. How do we deal with the levels of various ways of describing this? One could put it in terms of describe it as corruption or just dysfunction of our political systems. How do everyday people go about doing that? I think on the one hand, the people need to really take it upon themselves to engage.
He's gone.
And this it's becoming a very difficult conversation to have. I'm sad to say. See, as you can tell, he dropped out again.
Let's call this day. Yeah, let's call this day. I do appreciate Dr. Piers Robinson for coming on, and hopefully we can get a better signal next time he comes on, because this is a really interesting combo. And so I do appreciate it. What do you think about what he said about the propaganda thing? Do you think it's necessary and crucial in a society? Say, for example, you had a society, a Jack Fresco society, this kind of, this elimination of poverty, elimination of climate issues, people are happy, et cetera, et cetera. If you have that world and you have that society, what do you use to keep that society on the rails, as opposed to having that society veer off in this kind of dissent and alienation that takes place as teenagers and different groups grow? Don't you need something like that to keep that population, I don't know, in a particular mindset, or not so much? The truth of it in and of itself should be enough. What are your thoughts on that one?
I think it has to. I think that so one initial difficulty is that the term propaganda, since it was coined not too long ago, I believe within the past 100 years, it's been a little while since I was looking into this stuff, but I'm pretty sure it's a pretty recent term. Since it was coined, since it has spread throughout the public's usage, since it's become a part of the vernacular, it has been extended in different ways to the point where I've now heard a lot of people referring to pretty much any form of communication as propaganda. In fact, this was a joke that my friend and I had as teens. We were growing up. We were looking at different sources of news and just different things that people saying. At a certain point, we were like, that's propaganda, man. What you're saying there is propaganda. And we weren't talking about politics. It was just anything with a biased point of view. If I guess at the final extremity, anything that anybody says with a certain amount of bias can be seen as propaganda. But to me, that is very clearly a degradation of the term. That makes the term so universal, the idea so universal, that it kind of doesn't mean anything anymore. And generally, when we call things propaganda, we're saying that we don't like them. It's effectively what that has come to mean. Unless you're doing it kind of ironically, if you're going to call something propaganda, well, that really means is it's biased speech you don't like. So I don't think that's an appropriate use of the term. So to quote like Mark Frost, or to come back to ideas that I think Tom Luongo presented as libertarians, probably you got to have some return to first principles. Like, what is the term that you're using even mean? That's too long a conversation, and in my opinion, in a weird way, it's actually not all that useful in this case. When I'm using the term propaganda, and I'm pretty sure when you're using the term propaganda too, broadly we mean a more or less coherent set of biased messages, which include certain facts, which leave out certain facts, promulgated by a central power of some type or another, by some kind of authority. Anyway, I don't think that you need a society that has propaganda. I think that you can have a society that includes enough types of information and enough open discourse around that information, around what's true, that it wouldn't fit the bill when we're using the term. The problem is, and I don't even know if you can design a society. How do you grow a society like that? How do you become a society like that? That's a really complicated question in political philosophy, man. Piers is back to do with something like, you need non-contradiction between your deeper philosophical and political beliefs. You need there to be a match between what you're doing and what you're saying. And you need that to extend between levels such that there's not a contradiction between certain levels and some others, that there's not contradictions between what the economic establishment, what banks, et cetera, if they exist in this hypothetical society, what they're doing, what the military is doing, what the government is doing, what the people want, what the people have put into power, between all those different levels. And if you have parity, if you have a match, then in some sense, you will not need to lie to people because they'll be more or less satisfied with the way things are going. And you can have a society that incorporates, in fact, lives on dissent. You can have a society that thrives on like a critical outlook on what you're doing. The problem with that is it's not very good for the rent-seeking classes. It is not good for groups of people who have invested their lives and their livelihoods in certain ways of, supporting their own power. And then when those sources of power are criticized, suddenly everything, it's like a house of cards that risks falling down. That's where it gets a little bit dangerous. And so another way of saying this is you need a society that can continuously sort of combat and reform the rent seekers, whoever those are, whatever those look like. Anyway, that was way too expansive of an answer, but we've got some time to fill. I hear we have Piers Robinson back, and we're going to try to get him on for this conversation. Piers, do we have you with us?
Yeah, you do. I'm on the phone line now, so hopefully that will work a bit better.
Thank you for joining us. I believe Jamarl had asked you a question before you went out. Sorry about all these tech problems. What were you saying? Can we get back into it?
Well, I think there's a question about how people can realize democracy, what the average person should do, and there's also the question about the necessity or not of propaganda. I mean, I think we're at a point in Western civilization in the early 21st century where we do have fundamental problems with most of the institutions in our society, and there really needs to be, a broad, across political ideology, but across left and right drive to restore democracy and to restore our institutions, whether it's mainstream media or whether it's academia or government legislative. That needs to be regained at this point in time, and there's no way around people getting involved, getting engaged, and mobilizing in order to try to achieve that. We've had decades where political scientists have said, well, the masses are apathetic, they don't care anymore, and so on, and are disengaging from politics. Well, we're at a crisis point now in the West for a whole number of reasons, and the time for apathy, I think, is over, and people need to engage. I think there was a kind of a question in there about propaganda and utility of propaganda. I mean, propaganda can be justified in, I think, exceptional circumstances. But as a general rule, it's the antithesis of proper democratic, rational debate to allow propaganda. And it is possible for movements and political movements to engage in persuading people in a way that doesn't involve manipulation, which doesn't involve deception or incentivization or coercion, which is genuinely democratic. And I think one of the things which needs to be learned, in particularly by governments and other powerful actors, is what the limits are to persuasion when you're slipping from trying to persuade people in a way which is essentially consensual, and when you're slipping into deception and coercion. I think probably in the last 50 years, I think there's an awful lot of political messaging slipped well into the territory of deception through the patterns of omission and selection and exaggeration. Many political communicators have no idea what they're actually doing, or they have no idea about how propagandistic it is what they're engaging in. And there really needs to be a real thoroughgoing thinking through of what counts as ethical democratic persuasion, and to get away from the levels of propaganda we have, which really make it very difficult to effect political change, makes it difficult to hold power to account, and makes it difficult to sort of realize some of the objectives that were just being spoken about a few minutes ago.
One.
The voice that you guys are listening to, or that you were listening to just now, Dr. Piers Robinson, political scientist and co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. You can follow Dr. Robinson on Twitter at PiersRobinson1 and his blog, piersrobinson.wordpress.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Jane Stranahan.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, 4,101 new coronavirus deaths and 155,470 new cases were reported in the United States on January 27th. Over the past week, there's been an average of 163,159 cases per day, a decrease of 34% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Thursday morning, more than 25,640,200 people in the United States have been infected with coronavirus, and 429,312 have died from it. Again, just pointing out, that number will pop back up to 4,000 very quickly. And you heard it on this channel that when that number dropped to like 1,000 or 2,000, that wasn't going to last. That number probably wasn't accurate. And just from the standpoint of the weekend, for whatever reason, the number drops. So we're back up to 4K a day, more than 9/11. It's shocking. Just to pivot there for a moment, just for 1 second, we literally, real terms, flat back true, invaded another country because of a tower that was hit, 2 towers, and 3,000 lives lost. And we have lost nearly 3,000 lives, basically going back for the past nearly 6 months. We were willing to spend $7 trillion. We were willing to kill 1 million people, and not including 4,000 Americans, in order to do this. I don't understand how the blood and treasure that is perfectly, that this government is perfectly willing to spend on something like that, but when it comes down to protecting the population, 420,000 Americans drop dead. And for whatever particular reason, the idea that this should be the priority wasn't there. It's shocking, honestly. The 4,000 number is in and of itself shocking, and the 429,000 in less than a year is that much worse. So yeah, that number is astonishing. Yesterday, Colombian President Ivan Duque announced Colombia has suspended air traffic with Brazil for a month over the spread of the new strain of coronavirus. Peru has announced new lockdowns for 10 to 25 regions, including the capital Lima, as COVID-19 rises and hospitals reach a breaking point. The lockdowns will start on January 31st. A rural Georgia medical center has been suspended from state's COVID-19 vaccination program for 6 months after the facility administered vaccines to staff of the local school district. Oh, that is not good. And here's another one. The Hunterdon Medical Center, a New Jersey hospital, has been accused of allowing wealthy donors, executives, and their relatives to skip the COVID-19 vaccine line, giving their shots when only frontline workers, healthcare workers, and nursing home residents were eligible. The group includes hospital CEO, his wife, other executives, their spouses, and their kids. Shane, I'm going to bring you in for this one. So the rural Georgia Medical Center suspended the state's vaccination program. All right. And then you have this other one, Hunterdon Medical Center, New Jersey hospital, basically accused of giving it to wealthy donors and relatives, allowing them to skip the COVID-19 line for basically first responders. Now, in both of these cases, the thing that peeks out here is the hospitals that were delivering the vials and the vaccinations, those were potential areas where people actually need them. So the rural Georgia Medical Center, for example, the fact that that's added rural, meaning how many more of those centers are available to give people those shots? And are they going to be able to pivot to somewhere else? It's not that I'm saying rah, or keep this medical center in place. I'm kind of pointing out the problem or the difficulty in trying to find sites for people to come for those injections. And yeah, I don't disagree with the penalty or any of that. I'm more so asking whether or not there's going to be some secondary site to replace the site that basically went belly up.
I don't get why the penalty makes sense. These are not like random people. These aren't even random rich folks. These are like staff at a school district, which would be one of the main points of spread. Okay, they broke the rules slightly. They're in phase 1A. They're in the early phase, and technically the staff that they gave the vaccinations to didn't qualify for it. But is the response really to shut them down for 6 months, or is the response to request more vaccines so that you have more than enough to distribute? Like, it seems very counterproductive to be shutting down a medical facility in the midst of a medical crisis. Not shutting down the facility as a whole, but shutting down their ability to distribute vaccines when, frankly, we need a lot more vaccines distributed.
So what do you think they should do?
They don't trust them to do it. But.
I mean, I guess what I'm asking, should there be a penalty for it then? Because keep in mind, if there is no penalty for it, then that basically implicitly allows pretty much everybody who's distributing the vaccine to basically palm it for themselves and their families, etc.
But that's not what was happening here. Again, these were staff at the school, so this wasn't a sort of nepotistic small game where they were giving away vaccines to their loved ones. This was them giving it to people who were frontline essential workers, working in a hub where you would want people to not be quickly spreading the virus. So again, it's not, if they're going to do something, if they want to teach them a lesson, like give them a formal reprimand. Give them, some sort of warning that they shouldn't be doing this again. And at the same time, promise to increase the amounts of vaccines that they will receive to more than make up for the shortfall that they themselves incurred by giving the stuff out to people who didn't, quote unquote, need it or who didn't qualify for it at this early stage. But to just produce more vaccines and distribute them more effectively and keep your gosh darn vaccination distribution centers open, it doesn't make sense to shut them down like that.
So what about the Huntington Medical Center? Should that one also get a pass?
I mean,
and that one is more flagrant, by the way. That one is far more egregious. So let's just be clear on that one.
Yeah, because it was apparently they were giving it to rich folks. And then there's the question, were they doing it not because these people bought them or bribed them necessarily, but were they maybe doing it because they had given a donation to the hospital or something like that? There are cases in which you might have a commitment to somebody that's not due to direct financial gain. It's not due to, them giving you money on the scene. It could be that, and that's, I'm not saying that's not corrupt. That is corrupt. I'm just saying it's a little bit more, it's a little bit harder to follow. I would say at the very least, you do exactly what I recommend in the other case. You give the people who are responsible a formal reprimand. You warn them that if they do this kind of thing again, they will be fired. There will be other problems on the line. And then you make sure that you give them more vaccines because frankly, the more people that get vaccinated, the better. It's just in what order you're supposed to be doing it.
Yeah, I disagree with that one. I can agree with you with the school one. I can totally agree with you with that. Not, slap them on the wrist. These are basically frontliners. These are people who are part of the staff. Fair enough. And I never postulated that money exchanged hands in the second one. I'm just saying that they did it. The group includes hospital CEO, his wife, other executives, their spouses, and kids. Basically, it's a big club. You ain't in it, and we're going to partition it out. That one is different for me. That one, I do think they should shut them down on this. That's a big deal. I mean, this is not just a few people who are part of a school or something like that. These are basically people of means and who weren't part of the mix, meaning they could stay at home. There wasn't a situation where these guys needed to be out there at a 7-Eleven or at some particular place working, putting their lives on the line, making this choice between their kids versus their own safety. Most of the wealthy, the higher up on the income ladder you were, the less likely you had to expose yourself to the virus. So I take great qualms with this one, even though I agree with you on the second one. I can totally hear that out. I feel your point on that one. That one seems too extreme, especially in a rural area where you actually need the vaccines. That how many other centers? Fair enough. I disagree with you on the Huntington one. That one seems far more egregious.
It is.
Yeah. Let's keep going. Hundreds of Holocaust survivors in Austria and Slovakia got their first dose of coronavirus vaccine Wednesday, an acknowledgement of past suffering and a tribute to the resilience 76 years after Soviet troops liberated Auschwitz death camps in Nazi-occupied Poland. And let's just put an underline on that. It was Soviet troops that liberated Auschwitz. We get taught something else in America. More than 1,000 Columbia University students are withholding this semester's tuition as they demand the Ivy League school in New York lower its cost amid financial burdens and move to online classes prompted by coronavirus pandemic, accusing the school of demonstrating a, quote, flagrant disregard for initiatives democratically supported within the community, unquote. The striking students are asking the school to lower tuition by at least 10% and to increase financial aid. The letter also asked the school to end the expansion into gentrification of West Harlem, defund the university police force, and bargain in good faith with campus unions. Interesting. I like that. I like that, I think. The World Health Organization is refusing to confirm whether the coronavirus originated in China as President Biden strengthens his administration's ties with the entity. President Biden has promised to overturn President Donald Trump's decision in June to cut off funds to the World Health Organization and withdraw the U.S. from the agency. Continuing with Joe Biden, U.S. President Joe Biden has signed a series of executive orders designed to address climate change, including a new ban on some energy drilling. The order aims to freeze new oil and gas leases on public land and double offshore wind produced by 2030. They're expected to meet stiff resistance from the energy industry and come as a sea change from Donald Trump, who cut environmental protections across the board. Quote, "Today is a climate day at the White House," unquote, said Mr. Biden on Wednesday. Quote, we have already waited too long," unquote, Mr. Biden told reporters at the White House, "and we can't wait any longer." The series of executive orders that Mr. Biden signed on Wednesday establishes a White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy and announces a summit of leaders to be held in April on Earth Day. Climate change, under Mr. Biden's plan, will become a national security and foreign policy priority, officials say. In fact, the gentleman that Biden brought on to head the military is basically saying the same thing, that climate change is a threat to basically a national security threat. A former attorney for Cuban-American Proud Boy leader Enrique Tarrio told a court hearing that in 2014, the right-wing group's leader was an FBI informant and helped federal authorities bust marijuana-growing operations, gambling houses, and human trafficking rings in Florida, where he was arrested in 2012. Tarrio has denied the claims. Shane, what do you think about that one? That's a big deal. So the gentleman who was basically part of the Proud Boys, who's leading these guys, basically, you find out he's basically a narc. And that he was working with the cops as an informant. Now, I would imagine if you were working with the Proud Boys, an organization that has, let's say, dipped its toe or whole foot or leg or, let's say, body into balance, that looks bad. And that is going to have deleterious consequences for him and that group, providing that they disbelieve the claims. Meaning, if they believe these claims to any iota, he's going to have a hard go of it. But he's denying it. What do you think?
I think, we covered this briefly earlier. I think it's suspicious. I think it's funny that his attorneys are saying it and that he's denying it. He would definitely lose his cred with the Proud Boys. Having said that, a lot of folks who were part of the Proud Boys, I'm sure, are now wondering, is this whole thing like an FBI setup or something? I don't know if you can take it that far, but assuming it's true, it's interesting that he was able to get into that position, and I wonder how many of the folks, the rank and file members, as well as the leadership of the Proud Boys, knew about that. It's interesting from that perspective, and definitely for all the folks who will occasionally bring up the idea that agent provocateurs are leading. We were having this conversation yesterday, of course. That agent provocateurs are leading certain opposition movements in the U.S. This is one point in your favor, at least in this case. And I'm not saying that he is an agent provocateur, that it's direct evidence of that stuff, but it's points in that column. I'll put it like that.
That's fair. That's fair. But the agent provocateur thing is real. I think my thing was we can't.
100%.
Yeah,
no,
we just
totally.
can't lean on it without evidence for it. And I think in this particular case, that's evidence, whether it's flat fact true or not.
That's exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, didn't mean to cut you off, but that's exactly what I was saying. And I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. I'm just saying in any specific case, including when you're trying to describe a movement generally, I meant what I said at the end of the show yesterday. If you can say that a movement is led by agent provocateurs across the board simply because it's likely for them to be led by agent provocateurs based on what the U.S. government has done, in the past, then you're just discrediting any movement that holds a hope of reforming things, as far as I can tell. That's a slight reductio ad absurdum. It's a slight fallacy on my end, but not really. If you use that in a lot of these cases, then I'm worried that that's what that's going to lead to. It's kind of a slippery slope. Anyway, Jamarl.
You know what's wild? If you remember after the election when Clinton, those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, so if you remember when Clinton loses and you get the situation where Trump wins and they start saying that climate change and African Americans were basically pushed by social media and propaganda on social media. Like, this stuff is insane, right? By the same token, you still need some level of reality where you can put your feet on the floor. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I'm going to go back to headlines for just a moment here because there's one that I added in after I did my badge, and it's way down the list. So, Jamarl, it makes sense. You didn't have time to get to it. We're often rushed for time in these segments anyway. We end up talking about this stuff. This one has to do with drones and AI. I'm going to read this. The head of the U.S. Army's forward-looking Army Futures Command Group, General John Murray, told a webinar audience at the Center for Strategic and International Studies that humans may not be able to fight swarms of enemy drones and that the rules governing human control over artificial intelligence might need to be relaxed. In other words, we have had rules set up about what level of control AI programs running our military systems are able to have over those systems. The idea is you want somebody in the loop. You want to have this term for it. You want a human, not necessarily in the loop, but a human on the loop. That's admittedly, it seems like a small difference or whatever. You don't want necessarily a human to be stopping an AI from making a direct decision, but you at least want some human being to have responsibility, to be taking responsibility, to have some level of control over the decisions that AI is making in the system. Now, this stuff is all scary, in my opinion. If you look at real long-term trends, like real deep changes in our society, our technology and stuff. I want to come back to Wall Street bets because that's another one I would say that's super significant in just a couple of minutes. But AI control of armaments and weapons is crazy important. However, what they're saying, it kind of makes sense. You can't necessarily, human beings are not necessarily going to be quick enough or adaptive enough, on a millisecond by millisecond basis to respond to what another team of AI-controlled drones is doing. We're just potentially a little bit too slow. And so you might have AIs fighting AIs with these drone swarms, and that's basically what the general's saying. Having said that, for all the people who have watched the Terminator movies, for all that we're afraid of Skynet and that idea, it might not be nukes that the AI insurrection uses to take over. It might be drones. I'm not serious about that one necessarily, but hey, in any event, Jamarl, this is just insane. It makes sense to me, so I'm not going to say it's insane, which is where I was heading, but it's worrying. That's a good word for it.
It's dystopian.
The whole call and response of it.
Yeah, it's dystopian, to put it mildly. And we were always going there. The first time that ape threw that bone into the sky, we were basically, inexorably coming to this very specific point. We typically value human life in war, meaning we don't want our soldiers getting killed. And so from our standpoint, and from other countries' standpoint, if you have the resources, the idea is, how do we save our soldiers? So right off the bat, the moment that you get technology, your first thought is, how can I marshal this technology to save my soldiers while killing the others? Well, that's a gun, that might be body armor, but eventually that gets to the point of, what about an exoskeleton? Well, what about just a drone? What about not having a human being there at all? What about not even having the person firing the kill shot. Because again, if you fire the kill shot, that is on the individual's conscience, and some of the drone pilots can have a difficult time with that. So if you can even get rid of that, great. But is that great? You basically have robots killing and making the choice on people to basically kill death by flying killer robots in various Middle East engagements without anybody being at the helm, with the exception of the logic that the software or the programmer put into it. So, I mean, that's like dystopian is an understatement, but legit, yeah. I mean, think about the cars, like for a moment. The moment that you have some automated cars, you have a problem, because it's the issue of the transition. When you have all cars that are automated, where all the cars can talk to each other on the road, no issue. In this particular case, it's going to be something similar, where you have these drones talking to one another, communicating with one another, making battle plans. And like you say, Shane, if you're talking about like a big war, or a war against a peer, you're talking about drones versus drones, be it in the water, be it in the air, or on land. Dystopian.
And the thing, here's the, I'm going to pivot on the other side of this. It is drone swarms that you're worried about. It is these large groups of very cheap, individually manufactured. Each unit is pretty cheap. When you put them together, they're deadly, and it's like hard to know how to resist them. We should come back to this at some point. But let's talk about this whole thing with GameStop. Let's come back to this because we don't really have enough time to go over this before. The idea is GameStop, longtime game retailer, been around for decades. It's been long known as a sort of brick and mortar paradise for gaming nerds growing up, because you'd go in and wall to wall, whether it's consoles or I think they've shifted away from PC games, but they did have those. They were stocking those, and those were a big factor back in the day. But now it's mostly console stuff because it's a lot easier to buy in person. You can't really buy, it's harder to buy in a lot of cases, games, and particularly paraphernalia like controllers and stuff online. Anyway, brick and mortar store, which had been in decline, as many brick and mortar stores are, as they're competing with online retailers, and which has also come under an increasing decline, of course, since the start of the pandemic. It just accelerated things. They're closing hundreds of stores last year. I'm going to add in a couple of things here. Michael Burry, who some folks might know, there was a movie made about him, but I'm forgetting the name of the movie. I've watched it at one point a long time ago. He was the investor who back in 2008 was warning about the financial crisis. That is how he's known. He's a physician and a hedge fund manager who in 2008 shut down his hedge fund. And he was portrayed by Christian Bale in a movie whose name I'm forgetting. Anyway, he bought into GameStop last year. He was like recommending that they do stock buybacks. This sort of led to an uptick in their stock value, which had been stagnating at around $4 a share for a long time at that point, for most of 2020. Then he got in, some other institutional investors came in, and their stock price started to go up. It went up from like $4 a share to like 15 over a certain period. And then within the last couple of weeks, it has skyrocketed because this subreddit group, Wall Street Bets, which I've been following for a little while now, paying attention to what they're doing, they came in, and in a bid to sort of save the company and to contest the power of institutional investors, specifically hedge funds who were shorting the company, they came in, bought up a bunch of stocks, and drove the value up. Then Elon Musk tweeted about it, and the stock rallied even higher. That will often happen when he does it with stocks. And now they're also rallying behind other companies. So they've gone behind the share for BlackBerry. They've gotten behind the shares for AMC, like the movie theater company. Again, another brick and mortar company that's been facing sharp declines. They've gotten behind Bed Bath & Beyond. They've gone behind another, like just a major batch of these brick and mortars. And the idea is they're not just trying to make money, because if you buy on the way up, then you can sell when it gets to its top, whenever that comes. I've heard people making arguments that they're trying to save the brick and mortar stores themselves. They're trying to keep them alive or keep them afloat. And they're also, I would say most importantly, trying to contest the power of these massive institutional investors. Specifically, there's this company that you brought up, Merlin Capital, Mervin Capital, pardon me.
Melvin Capital. It's the
Melvin. Thank you, Melvin Capital.
They need a huge influx of cash, billions of dollars in cash just to stay afloat. And there's suspicions.
And they lost like $3 billion on it.
Yeah, tons of money.
They lost tons of money. There were $5 billion thrown into shorting GameStop, and their $3 billion was basically washed. They had to do a correction, they called it, where they basically covered their losses. And they've lost billions of dollars. And there are different ways of looking at this. Now, the one that I think strikes a lot of people is like the David versus Goliath thing, where you have a group of individual investors, like retail investors, small-time investors, who are congregating online, who decide in a crowd to go in for this and are able thereby to wipe out billions of dollars of value for these big hedge funds, these big institutional investors. And I don't know if that's the only way or that's the right way or that's the last way, but that's the one that strikes me for sure. Jamarl, you were talking about this earlier. You know, this was your monologue. What's your take on this? Let's come back to it for a minute.
Well, I love this. I love the story. Like I said, oftentimes it's the hedge funds. It's the big time, the billionaires of that type that drag the market one way or the other. And it's everybody else that gets caught up in the wake. And in this very specific instance, you have a Reddit group that has been backing brick and mortar stores. Like I said, this particular one, the AMC, I just saw up 200%. And yeah, GameStop. Now, the reality of it is, like I said, this is like a $10, $20 stock. And the stock is up to like $200 to $300. I haven't looked at it recently, but exploded. And so all of those people, they lost $13.9 billion by itself yesterday alone. And so they are talking about regulations now. Did you hear about this? Like CNBC have been crying all day and crying, oh, this is wrong. This isn't right. We need regulation. And like I said, they shut down the server. Apparently, it was only for a short period of time that they shut it down. But it's just the point that they did it. And it's like they did it on this idea of, well, they were saying things on the site that was unseemly and we didn't particularly like it, so we shut them down. But it's a group of 2 million people. How are you going to police all 2 million people in a group of 2 million people? It's impossible. It was used as a fig leaf to shut them down because of what took place in regards to those billionaires losing their shirts and crying on CNBC about it. So we were playing the video. I mean, some of these guys was like, I can take the position that this is foreign powers. And then somebody else angry at the guys for doing it, talking about marketing manipulation, all this nonsense. None of these people were bothered totally. None of them were bothered when they were shorting that stock. Not one. And so now everybody is hollering about it. So, yeah.
Well, here's the other side of this.
Oh, go for it.
And here's the thing that I find that's actually hilarious about this. This stock should not be worth this much. And I think that part of what's going on here,
like
it's not
$5
a money-making opportunity. It's like
stock.
Yeah.
I mean, like
well,
even if it's
a $15.
Yeah, it's the same.
No, and yes. So I think that another deeper level of this is and I don't want to read too much into this. This might just be me giving my take. I think they are trying to make a mockery of our financial system. The idea that a random hodgepodge of folks can, like the fact that they can go up against the hedge fund, that's one thing. But if you actually look at what they're doing, it is on its face ridiculous and kind of ironic. These are like, I'm guessing, a lot of folks who are fanboys of GameStop, who have been for a long time, who have decided to artificially inflate the value, not just as a money-making opportunity, but in some sense, I would say, because they think the whole thing is hilarious and they're using Wall Street as their toy, which is, again, an indictment of our financial system as a whole. And I think that for a lot of folks who are engaged in it, it's intentional. I've seen some people saying that stuff. I don't want to say it's super widespread among the crowd, but I think it's kind of in the air. And to the extent that they're doing that, all the power to them, I guess. And yeah, I have seen the calls for regulations. It's insane and ridiculous. And I wonder when they'll be called domestic terrorists just for buying and selling stocks. Jamarl.
That's funny. Was they calling them domestic terrorists because they're buying and selling stocks? No, I think, and tell me what you think about this. Do you think the issue here is that this was done by the unwashed masses, as opposed to, let's say, a hedge fund doing something like this, or a bunch of investors doing something like this? Like, they treat Wall Street like a casino. And then when somebody else does it, there's hysteria over it. So, yeah, I don't have an issue with this. I think it's great that these guys are, look, don't do this, because that stock is going to collapse at some point, and it's going to lose like 90% of its value if at some point it becomes more tethered to the ground in regards to its real value. But do I take issue with this? No, I don't. Is it a casino? Yes. Is it are they manipulating it in some way? No more than what anybody else does. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people.
Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to cash them out,
We actually let them expand on their views.
What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are now joined by our next guest, Maram Susli, otherwise known as Syria Girl, Partisan Girl. She is a political commentator and geopolitical analyst. You can follow her on Facebook and Twitter at Partisan Girl. Find her on YouTube by searching for Syrian Girl Partisan, and support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Syrian Girl. Maram, thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Can you hear me well?
Absolutely. Yeah, sparklingly. Let's talk about GameStop. I saw you tweeting about this. We were just having a conversation about this. This has to do with, like we were saying a couple of minutes ago, Wall Street Bets, this subreddit over on the website Reddit, basically deciding to go all in over the past few weeks for the game store, brick and mortar retailer for the most part, GameStop, back here in the States. And in the process, they've driven the stock up. It has skyrocketed from like $15 a share to $350 a share. And now in pre-trading this morning, looking at it, it's above $400 a share. We'll see what actually happens when the market opens. Anyway, they did this. A bunch of big hedge funds were shorting the stock. Those hedge funds have proceeded to lose billions of dollars. One of them, Melvin Capital, has lost like $3 billion since this thing started, and they've had to back out of their positions there. And the crowd over on the subreddit, over on Wall Street Bets, they're emboldened by this, to say the least. They've expanded their efforts, and now instead of just focusing on GameStop, they're also trying to resuscitate AMC, the movie theater company. They're trying to do it with the tech company BlackBerry. They're trying to do it with a number of other brick and mortars. They're trying to sort of expand their efforts, and all signs appear to be that they're succeeding at this. Just in a broad sense, we have our take. We're talking about the David versus Goliath kind of a thing. I was saying I think they're kind of making a mockery of not just hedge fund managers, but also our financial system as a whole. Maram, I know you've been following this. You've been talking about it. What's your take on what's going on?
I did watch it unfold, a day ago. It began, I suppose, maybe 2 days ago. And I think that this is more than just sending a message or more than like making a statement. This has the potential to collapse the entire Wall Street. I used to be part of the Occupy Wall Street movement. I went to the protests, and this is the real Occupy Wall Street. This is what Occupy Wall Street should have been. And I think these days, since everybody's, this newer generation, they're more savvy, tech savvy. They have access to more information online. Certainly, they've been trapped at home without jobs. Now, the lay person, like the average person, has the knowledge to, work with the stocks. Ironically, this has mostly been done on an app called Robinhood, where you steal from the rich and you give to the poor. And so all of these hedge funds are, they started it, really. You have to remember that the manipulation started with them. They began all together to short the stocks for GameStop. And they said that they have more shares than they could possibly have. And now that the price has risen instead of dropped, they're going to have to buy those shares at that higher price, meaning they have to give out their billions and billions of dollars to the average person that bought the GameStop stock. And, they decided to take the risk. So they should fall. They should give that money up. But they're not used to playing fair. they're used to stealing from people and destroying lives. And they think that they control the rules, and they want to create laws that stop people from stop the average person from being able to do this. It's funny that they're really showing their face. They're censoring discords. They're calling people Nazis. They're getting the FBI involved. They're getting the government, the new President Biden involved. They're basically screaming and trying to find every bit of their influence to get out of paying what they owe. And that's what they're used to doing. They're used to stacking the deck in their favor. And I would just hazard anyone, I would focus, I think that GameStop is a good stock. The other ones, this one was shorted, really, the short was really extreme. So there's an opportunity with GameStop. I don't know about the other ones. I wouldn't dilute this, because GameStop on its own could result in the whole thing just falling to the ground.
But that's the wild part about this, right? I mean, Wall Street is basically calling for regulation. When the market was tanked in 2008, nobody was, they certainly weren't necessarily screaming, regulate us. And in this very specific case here, they want some kind of legislation to prevent the unwashed masses from basically, betting or selecting a stock. What do you think this means? Oftentimes, when things happen, things have meaning beyond the fact that those things happen in some kind of just regular tangible space. What does this mean about the economic, or for that matter, the financial system, that after an event like this, the people who basically lost their shirts are crying for regulation as opposed to this idea of moral hazard? I even heard some people calling for a bailout for hedge funds. This stuff is so out there. Look, they're going to get their $1,400 check. They will be okay. What does this mean about our system if this is the way these guys respond to losing to the masses who have every right to participate in the stock market as they do?
It means that it's not a fair system. It's never been fair. These people are used to manipulating the system. How else do they make their billions? It's not because they're particularly intelligent. They're not smarter than the average person. They just know people. They have the resources to influence laws. And I would say that, if the fact that it's led to this, that they've shown their face, it's already a victory in and of itself. Hopefully not the only one. Hopefully they can't succeed in trying to regulate this. I don't see how they can. Are they going to censor the entire internet? They can censor Reddit, but there's other places that people can go that isn't Reddit. So, how far is this? How are they going to stop people from trading like regular people? I don't see how they can. Maybe they'll try to intimidate people with, maybe they'll be able to change some laws. They do have power in the government. But I think if they do that, then that tells people that the rich are rich and the poor are poor, and you're always going to be that way, and there's no way to change it. And that breaks down the illusion of, it's a fair system, capitalism is fair, you just have to be smarter than the rest. That bubble will pop. And that I think people will react to that. I don't see how they won't react to that, especially now with the economic system, with the economic crisis as it is.
Well, and here's the thing: is it has started to spread. Some European markets have started to slump, and this is because it's not just over GameStop. It's also that the hedge funds have started to pull their short positions in other "quote unquote" meme stocks. These other stocks that they had been sure we're going to go down in value, but now because Wall Street bets, because of this band of retail investors pushing back on them pretty much across the board, they can't be sure anymore. So they've closed out their positions on other short. They've closed out their shorts on other stocks as well. And this has started to affect the wider stock market. If in the States we decide to crack down on this, Maram, what do you think the implications of that are? Not just politically, but economically. Where do you think that effort would go? What would that yield in terms of results?
I think when you yield a civil war, if I'm going to be blatantly frank, I mean, at the moment people are trying to take some power, some money back at home, behind a computer. And if they take that away, they're essentially telling people that all these years of these, these people trading behind closed doors, destroying company after company, shorting stocks, they're targeting people's jobs. That's fine. That goes unregulated. But when, a guy with $600 wants to make a little bit of money, suddenly the law is going to crack down on 3 million people. What does that say to the whole world? It says that the system is bogus. It says this system it's not fair. It's an oligarchy. This is an oligarchy, or you can think of it as a corporatocracy, but more so probably an oligarchy, because these people don't actually produce anything. Like, these hedge funds don't actually create things that people use or need. So
no, they just trade and perceived value.
Yeah,
and I want to add this in, and then I'll pass it to you real quick, Jamarl. This is coming from our audio engineer, Andre, who occasionally, I'm not going to try to give too much away, but I think he said this stuff before. He occasionally uses the app Robinhood in question. He's saying he's on there right now. He's looking at a number of stocks, including Gamestop. He's looking at AMC. He's looking at Naked Clothing Company, which I believe is another stock at hand here, and he can't buy them anymore. He's saying the app is telling him that they're not available. It is not supported on the app. So that's happening. Anyway, Jamarl, you were saying something. I didn't mean to cut in there.
No, you're fine. Always cut in for new information. My wife uses Robinhood. It's like these little small lenders that come together and hobble together to make their purchases, and they talk, they converse, and she would be like, "Hey, this stock is going to do well," because at that point, it's just small time lenders having their conversations about the market, and oftentimes they're right. And so they even the application even came to end or just stopped working. Maram, what do you think this goes? I mean, like, do we really believe that legislation is going to be passed for this? I mean, there's speed trading, those micro trades or whatever, that they can kind of get ahead just by a few split seconds ahead of the rest of the market. Like, none of this stuff gets regulated, like talking about. Like, I don't know. It's just profound that A, this happens, and then B, all of these oligarchs out there crying because they lost their shirt. The moral hazard aspect of this doesn't necessarily apply.
I mean, I doubt
what do you think
they lost
this
their
goes?
shirt. I'm sure they still have their $1 million mansions. Right. I'm sure it's still fine, but they have to pay, we're talking about two people like Melvin Capital. We're talking about two people that are sitting on billions.
Yeah.
Though that money could help millions of people.
And by the way,
get out of poverty.
When Wall Street drove Argentina into debt, do you remember this? Argentina had owed money or something to that effect, and they just literally tried to destroy the economy by reaping or getting money out of the country. Same thing to Puerto Rico. And so it's like now these guys are crying for some level of, hey, we need assistance. Yeah, that's what they're calling for. We need fairness.
Now it's not fair anymore.
Yeah, right.
It's pretty. Right. It's hilarious to watch. My fear is, like you said, they will request a government bailout, and that they would actually get it. That's my fear, because they apparently asked the State Department what their take on this GameStop thing is, and they said we're watching it closely. So does that mean the hedge funds are going to be paid by the taxpayers? So all of that money, like the Robin Hood took from the rich and gave to the poor, are the poor going to have to give that back to the rich?
They already did. I don't
think people are going to be able to take that.
Maram, they've done that for the last 30 years, especially under Donald Trump, especially under the CARES Act. Those things were the largest transfer of wealth from the standpoint of the poor to the rich. And the wild part about it, even before the CARES Act, you had a situation where Donald Trump passes a tax cut, and he pays for it on the backs of the poor and the middle class. And so this, that in and of itself, honestly, seemed to be grotesque. And so, the idea that the government may get involved in this is just that much worse.
I'm finding it hilarious.
Well,
sorry, go on.
It is hilarious in a certain dark mirror sort of way. The voice you guys are listening to is Maram Susli, political commentator and geopolitical analyst. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Fault lines.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and our guest, Maram Susli. She is a political commentator, geopolitical analyst, and chemist. You can follow her, by the way, on Facebook and Twitter at Partisan Girl. Find her on YouTube by searching for Syrian Girl Partisan and support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Syrian Girl. Maram, again, thanks for sticking with us. I'm going to change topics real quick. We were having the last 15-minute conversation about GameStop, the madness going on there, and potentially the decline and fall of the economic empire. I'm going to change and talk about Russia for a minute. You had a tweet the other day. I thought this was funny. You were talking about this new release back on January 23rd by Biden's administration condemning harsh tactics, crackdowns, detentions over the Navalny protests. That's a topic of itself. But your quip on this was basically this is what they meant by Russian interference with Russia. If that were all they meant, I would be a lot happier because, frankly, there's a lot there that should be brought to light. But let's talk about this for a minute. Navalny's protests, at first the numbers were that hundreds of thousands of people were on the streets. Then that number was dropped down to less than 20,000. Last I saw it was around 15,000 people estimated across the country. I don't mean to make more comparisons between Russia and the States, but that is a dwarf of a number. It's a very small number compared to the numbers of protesters that we've seen in our country in a couple of different events in just the last year, not to mention going back to Trump's election back in 2016, where the Women's March was like hundreds of thousands of strong of people in Washington, D.C. So the numbers aren't quite there. And yet they're making it they're trying to make it a big diplomatic coup between Russia and the U.S. And of course, this is following the first conversation between President Biden and Vladimir Putin earlier this week. Where do you see this stuff going? We're talking about where you saw the institutional response to GameStop buyers going in the last segment. What do you see as the institutional response to Russia in the Biden administration? Let's just start there, Maram.
Well, I think there was a lot of banter between Biden and Trump about, Trump gets accused of leaning, soft on the Russians and hard on the Chinese, and Biden being hard on the Russians and soft on the Chinese. Maybe there's a little bit of truth to that. Maybe in terms of choosing who is the bigger enemy, the Biden administration is reverting back to the, focusing on Russia as the enemy rather than China as the enemy. Although they've said that they're going to do both. That's what they're claiming anyway. But doesn't mean that they're going to do both equally. I think they're going to, for the next 4 years, make Russia a focus. I think that part of the reason for that is Syria. The Russians have stood in the way of the U.S.'s agenda in Syria, which is to destroy and balkanize the country. So they've been a spoiler to that plan for several years. So perhaps not. So that goes alongside Biden's. He's going to do a push in Syria. He's trying to create a Kurdistan. He's going to promote that, and he's going to focus on Russia. Now, Navalny, I think they're trying to create the next Guaido of Venezuela. I'm sorry, I'm sure I butchered the pronunciation, but essentially, they're going to claim that he's the next president when nobody voted for him and he's not actually in power, and it doesn't have much support. Navalny, he is kind of, they're calling him an ultra-nationalist. I'm not so sure that that's such an accurate way to call him. I would say he's more of a West-centric, racist kind of guy. He hates Muslims. Even though there are millions of Muslims in Russia that are Russian citizens. He said that Muslims are cockroaches, essentially. Those were his words. And he's kind of trying to take a populist position on some issues. But when it comes right down to it, what he wants is for Russia to be part of the West European bloc and isolate itself and get out of the Mediterranean Sea. And in exchange for the US dropping sanctions, and that is his focus. Like, we have to help the Russian economy, and we have to basically kneel down to US hegemony and allow them to take over Syria. So on the one hand, he calls Muslims cockroaches, but on the other hand, he says that Russia chose the wrong side in Syria. And, Russia chose the Syrian government, and the other side was Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So he wants to choose Al-Qaeda. So there's a hypocrisy in there. Just a little bit of a background on this character, Navalny, and what they're pushing here. But I think it's kind of like failure to launch, because the protests were not big at all. And I find it such a hypocrisy that they talk about Russian interference and about brutality against protesters, when only a few weeks ago we're watching, people get shot, thrown off buildings and run over in protests in the US, both on the right wing and the left wing.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. And one of the other issues I kind of want to get into has to do with, just as a pivot real quick, Kurdistan. And that was something I wanted to talk to you about prior. There is a playbook that seems to take place where you find a leader, or somebody, doesn't even have to be a leader, it could be a random guy, in a country, and use that particular person as your wedge. That's your country. That's your in to that country. And you can dump resources, money, etc. into that particular person's hands. Be it, for example, Juan Guaido, that was one of the people we brought up. The MEK in Iran, this kind of cult that many of the politicians were backing. I think Giuliani was backing them. There was other politicians. This seems to be playbook. And so Navalny just happens to be the next character in this particular playbook. But I don't think that works in Russia, if I'm being bluntly honest. Also, the Kurdistan thing, let's talk about that for a moment. So Donald Trump left the Kurds in the lurch. Now, before the First World War, basically during the Ottoman Empire, you had a situation where Kurds could pretty much go, or people around the kingdom could go anywhere, because all of these things were part of the empire. The moment that they were broken up into countries, okay, we can't travel across these different places anymore. And so then it becomes this project, this never-ending, or the dream of Kurdistan. But in order to make that, you have to carve out various localities in various other nations. Now, the U.S. often use them as this kind of wedge inside Syria. And that's basically what is most likely going to take place with Joe Biden. Whereas Donald Trump pulled out and left the Kurds in the lurch, Biden is not going to do that. Or am I wrong on that? Is there anything I said there that was wrong, or did you want to expand upon?
I think that's very accurate. There is historical context that I'd like to provide that I think there's a lot of propaganda around. I think you're absolutely correct. But do you have anything else to add before I do that?
No, please.
I think Biden is going to make it the topic, and they're going to lie a lot. So the myth that is pushed around, that even I bought at some stage, was that after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Sykes-Picot, they carved out the nations from the Ottoman Empire, and along the way they forgot about the Kurds or Kurdistan. The reality is that when the Ottoman Empire, there's never been a Kurdistan. The thing is that Kurds were nomadic people up until World War I. Anyone can look this up. It's on CNN. It's a fact. They were nomadic people, which means that they never really settled and built a city. They moved around. So they moved across areas where people spoke different languages. They moved into what was Armenia before the Armenian genocide. They moved into North Iraq, which had the Assyrians in it, which spoke Syriac or Assyrian. And they moved, of course, originally, Kurds originate from Iran because they speak Iranian dialects. there's 4 different dialects of Kurdish, and they are an Iranian people originally, because Iran has many different groups of ethnicities. So they follow the Zagros mountain. That's why they say they have no friends with the mountains, is a common phrase, because they live the nomadic life around mountainous areas. Now, the thing is that they actually don't really have much of a history in Syria as like a mass of people. Their history in Syria was new, and it actually happened after World War I, when there was what happened during the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Armenian genocide in the early turn of the century, 1910, the Kurdish people actually participated in the genocide against the Armenians and the Assyrians, and the Turks promised them the homes of the Assyrian people, because as nomadic people they didn't actually like live in towns and homes, and so they took over the homes of the Armenians, but I think that they thought that they would have more autonomy, and that didn't transpire, so that resulted in multiple Kurdish revolts against the Turks. And from that, there were waves and waves of refugees that came into Syria, and they continued to do so up until the 80s. Whenever there was some fighting going on between the Kurds and the Turks, within Turkey's borders, they would come in. And Syria has basically a policy of, if you're born here and your parents are from Syria, then you'll have citizenship. But if you're a refugee, you're a refugee. You're not going to be a citizen. So the problem is now, like, as you said, the U.S. finds these groups that they can use, that they can collaborate. And they've convinced these people that for some reason they are owed Syrian land. And the issue is that, for example, Qamishli, the city in northeast Syria, that city was built by Assyrians. Like most of the cities in Iraq, like Kirkuk, not built by Kurds. These cities were built by other people. And other people still inhabit those cities. Like in northeast Syria, you still have Arabs, you still have Assyrians, and those other ethnicities are being genocided by the Kurdish militias that the U.S. are supporting. Because the Kurds in those areas, the northeast of Syria, are only 40% of the population. The other 60% are made up of other minorities. So they're a plurality, not a majority. And the worst bit of it is that actually the Kurds their population is concentrated all along the the Turkish-Syrian border, because that's where they came from, right? So, but the U.S.'s occupation is everything east of the Euphrates. So the population of Kurds there is 100% not in the majority, and yet they're trying to make it and convince people that this is going to be a Kurdistan, and it just so happens that it has all of Syria's oil and all of its wheat. So, what a coincidence. That's all I'm going to say.
Maram, we only have like a minute left.
Sorry
from
for
what
that
you're saying. No, that's not where I was going with that at all. Thanks for the overview there. It sounds like we're manipulating them, to be very simple. In our last minute, I know this isn't enough time, but do you see, if the United States were to back out, is there any solution to this that would satisfy not just the Syrian government, not just the Turkish government, not just the governments of Iraq and Iran, but would satisfy the Kurds as well? Is there any kind of universal resolution of this problem, anything approaching it? What's your take?
Yeah, if they have Syrian citizenship, then they will be equal to every other Syrian. I think that's fair.
Okay, fair enough. You know what? We've got to close it out here. Maram, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Hey, for those listening, that was Maram Susli, political commentator, geopolitical analyst, and chemist. You can follow her on Facebook and Twitter at Partisan Girl. Find her on YouTube by searching for Syrian Girl Partisan, and support her on Patreon at patreon.com/Syrian Girl. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back on the other side of this short break in just a minute with our headline segment. Be back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for our last hour this morning. That's the last hour of the most disruptive show in global and American news, politics, events, and more. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Going into the headlines here, first up in COVID news, at least 4,101 new coronavirus deaths and over 155,000 new cases were reported in the U.S. yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 163,159 cases per day. That is a decrease of 34% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Thursday morning, more than 25,640,200 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and at least 429,312 have died from it. Yesterday, Colombian President Iván Duque announced Colombia has suspended air traffic with Brazil for a month over the spread of a new strain of the coronavirus in that country. Meanwhile, Peru has announced new lockdowns for 10 of its 25 regions, including its capital, as COVID-19 cases rise and hospitals reach a breaking point. The lockdowns will start on January 31st. A rural Georgia medical center has been suspended from the state's COVID-19 vaccination program for 6 months after the facility administered vaccines to staff of the local school district. Like we were talking about earlier, I think they could have handled this better. Why shut down the facility for 6 months for basically giving it to people who also need it, albeit slightly less than the people who are in the tier they're currently supposed to be administering the vaccines to? It doesn't make sense to me. You can make a different case for our next headline, I guess. The Hunterdon Medical Center, a New Jersey hospital, has been accused of allowing wealthy donors, executives, and their relatives to skip the COVID-19 vaccine line, giving them their shots when only frontline healthcare workers and nursing home residents were eligible. The group includes the hospital CEO, his wife, other execs, their spouses, and kids. So this is a clear case of nepotism. I'll put it like that. Like we sort of disambiguated earlier, it's not necessarily, it's not, as far as we know, it's not the case that the medical center was getting paid to do this. But, it's nepotism. Hospital execs are giving their family members shots instead of the people who desperately need them. And unless every one of those family members is a frontline worker, no, this is not on the same moral standing as the other one. And I will note that the other facility in our headline, we noted they were suspended from operating for 6 months. I haven't seen that yet. I haven't researched this story, but that's not in this headline. So it's not as if they were shut down for administering nepotistic vaccines. Anyway, hundreds of Holocaust survivors in Austria and Slovakia got their first dose of a coronavirus vaccine yesterday. It's an acknowledgement of past suffering and a tribute to resilience 76 years after Soviet troops liberated the Auschwitz death camp in Nazi-occupied Poland. And I'm going to say it, a lot of these folks, by definition, are pretty old. So they are both in a position where, they would be affected by the coronavirus, pretty severely likely if they got it, and therefore in a position where they're of age and should be getting the shots first, or at least close to first. More than 1,000 Columbia University students are withholding this semester's tuition as they demand that the Ivy League school in New York City lower its cost amid financial burdens and the move to online classes prompted by the COVID-19 pandemic. They're accusing the school of demonstrating a quote-unquote flagrant disregard for initiatives democratically supported within the community. The striking students are asking the school to lower tuition by at least 10% and to increase financial aid. The letter also asks the school to end its expansion into and gentrification of West Harlem, defund its university police force, and bargain in good faith with campus unions. I've got to say, across the board, if you're only operating online courses, you should be lowering your tuition significantly, not just because people are getting less than they would have paid for in an otherwise normal year, but because you're having to spend less money is the assumption. Whether all that we're talking about is the utilities on campus or like reduced staff on campus, that's money that you're not spending on your end, and you should be passing that along to the students as a I would say an institution of public duty. Anyway, the World Health Organization is refusing to confirm whether the coronavirus originated in China as President Biden strengthens his administration's ties with the entity. There's a hedge on that. We'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. President Biden has promised to overturn President Donald Trump's decision in June to cut off funds to the World Health Organization and withdraw the U.S. from the agency. U.S. President Joe Biden has signed a series of executive orders designed to address climate change. It includes a new ban on some energy drilling. The orders aim to freeze new oil and gas leases on public lands and to double offshore wind-produced energy by 2030. They're expected to meet stiff resistance from the energy industry and come as a sea change from Donald Trump and his administration, which cut environmental protections. Mr. Biden on Wednesday said that today is Climate Day at the White House. We have already waited too long, and we can't wait any longer. The series of executive orders that President Biden signed on Wednesday establishes a White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy and announces a summit of leaders to be held in April on Earth Day. Climate change under Biden's plan will become both a national security and foreign policy priority, officials say. I wonder, does that mean that climate change considerations are going to play into our calculus over which countries we overthrow? Or is it that, like, we're going to try to make better diplomatic deals? Because I'm just wondering if it's going to fit into the former. Anyway, a former attorney for the Cuban-American Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio told a court hearing in 2014, the right-wing group's leader was an FBI informant and helped federal authorities bust marijuana growing operations, gambling houses, and human trafficking rings in Florida after he was arrested in 2012. He has denied the claims. Chicago's City Council voted Wednesday to designate the home where Emmett Till lived before his brutal death as a landmark. The Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley House, located in the city's Woodlawn neighborhood, will be converted into a museum. In international news, President Joe Biden's nominee for the post of U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, revealed during her confirmation hearing in the Senate that the Department of State is reviewing the possibility of designating the actions of the Chinese authorities in the Xinjiang region as, quote, genocide and crimes against humanity, end quote. This is the hedge that I was talking about a couple of minutes ago. Biden's administration is still trying to keep some pressure up on China. Whether that'll be more equal to or less than Trump remains to be seen, although, probably less than, considering that Trump tried to launch the trade war, and Biden will probably be walking back from something of that caliber, but we'll see. The Polish government has imposed a near total ban on abortions, including the termination of pregnancies with fetal defects, delivering a major blow to pro-choice advocates in one of Europe's most devout Catholic countries. The unexpected announcement that the ruling would take effect on Wednesday sparked nationwide protests, with demonstrators gathering in front of the ruling Law and Justice Party's offices. Yesterday in the UK, government ministers voted 363 to 267 to reverse the House of Lords October bill, called the Cover Human Intelligence Sources Bill, which was proposed as an effort to explicitly ban Downing Street from giving immunity to undercover agents who commit serious criminal offenses, including potentially murder and rape, as part of their operations. They should not have immunity. If you rape somebody, if you murder somebody, you should be held liable for that. I don't understand in what case you would have immunity for raping somebody. Murdering people, I guess maybe in some cases you're gonna have immunity for that, depending on whether it's seen as justified or not. But raping people, no. Russian authorities on Thursday detained several allies of opposition leader Alexei Navalny and issued warnings to social media giants after tens of thousands of people, not hundreds of thousands, but tens of thousands, took to the streets in over 100 Russian cities last weekend to demand his release. Detainees were held for 48 hours as part of a probe into alleged violations of coronavirus regulations during the weekend's protests. We've had a couple of conversations this week about Navalny. Mark Sloboda's segment on Navalny was good. He gave a great, expansive overview of Navalny, what his beliefs are, where he's coming from, what he wants, that kind of thing. One short takeaway, if United States consumers of media, if most folks knew who Navalny was and what he actually wanted, the kinds of things that he was saying that he defended and said in the past and that he continued to say to this day and continued to defend to this day, they would not like him. They would be like, wait, why are we backing this guy up? Anyway. Next headline today in Germany, a far-right extremist, 47-year-old Stefan Ernst, was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the June 1st, 2019 murder of Walter Lübcke, a member of Chancellor Angela Merkel's party who led the regional administration in the Kassel area of central Germany. Lübcke was targeted because he had been outspoken in favor of helping refugees. Prosecutors said Ernst had attended a 2015 town hall event where the politician had defended the German government's decision to allow hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers into the country. Ernst shot Luka on the politician's porch. He died hours later. Pakistan's Supreme Court on Thursday ordered the release of Ahmad Saeed Omar Sheikh, a Pakistani man convicted of the gruesome beheading of American journalist Daniel Pearl in 2002. An appeal of the acquittal by Pearl's family was dismissed. The court also ordered 3 other Pakistanis, also part of Pearl's kidnapping and death, to be freed. Pearl disappeared January 23, 2002, while investigating militant links to the so-called shoe bomber. His body was discovered in a shallow grave soon after a gruesome video of his beheading was delivered to the U.S. consulate in Karachi. In tech news, after imposing the temporary restriction on political advertising ahead of the 2020 presidential elections, yesterday Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg announced that his company will permanently stop promoting political groups and similar content to users. Zuckerberg added that Facebook is now considering further measures to reduce the amount of political content that users read in their news feed. So on the rosy side, and we're far enough through headlines, I want to get through this stuff before getting into the conversation, but I'll pass it to you on this one, Jamarl. On the upside of this, in the sort of rosy perspective, I can see, okay, Facebook's trying to make their timeline a little bit less political, a little bit more amiable, nicer to be on for folks who don't want to have to argue about politics all day long. On the slightly darker side, and I would argue the more realistic one, they're trying to prevent themselves from coming under fire from political members of either party or just the general public for, either suppressing political speech or not suppressing political speech, that kind of thing. Now, I'm sure they will still be doing a bunch of quote unquote misinformation targeting, where they either tag or block posts from people who are saying stuff that they disagree with, frankly. But I can't help but think that they're just trying to do this to cover their butts. Jamarl, what's your take?
Yeah, they don't want to be the whipping boy for this stuff. I mean, Congress was raking these guys over the coals for the last, 2 or 3 years as a result of the Clinton win. And, at the point where Congress is screaming at them to censor more, or for that matter, censor less. They're in the middle. And, I guess from his standpoint, he doesn't necessarily want to be a weapon unless he wants to be the weapon, if that makes sense. An idea with a sword. But from the standpoint of the way the politics and the politicians look at this, I would imagine they want to cow Facebook just like the mainstream media on some level. But Facebook is difficult to cow like that because it's not necessarily one source of information. I strongly suspect that you're right, that Zuckerberg I want to pull out of this. If he needs to get involved, fair enough. If he needs to go quote-unquote propaganda cleaning, fair enough. I am concerned about that with Twitter, and I'm concerned about that with Facebook. But yeah, I agree with you. I think he just wants to extricate himself from this conversation.
Maybe he's tired of going to Congress. Maybe he's tired of all those long flights out to Washington, D.C., and maybe more deeply, he's resentful of the people who share memes of him looking like a robot as he's sitting there sort of blankly responding to members of Congress, asking him admittedly banal questions, but hey, that's my hypothesis, nothing more. In our next headline, the head of the U.S. Army's forward-looking Army Futures Command Group, General John Murray, told a webinar audience at the Center for Strategic and International Studies that humans may not be able to fight swarms of enemy drones and that the rules governing human control over artificial intelligence might need to be relaxed. I would say that's a big headline. We're talking about this briefly earlier at about 8:15, almost an hour ago. In Earth and Science news, scientists at Moscow's National University of Science and Technology have managed, in cooperation with their French colleagues, to increase by 7 times the strength of titanium and stainless steel products. I'm going to say that's a big increase. According to the authors of the study, they have succeeded for the first time to combine 2 metalworking techniques that were considered incompatible. They have thereby achieved a dramatic improvement in material properties. I wish I knew this stuff well enough to actually understand what they did, just because it's inherently interesting, like material science is, foundational for technology. But hey, there you go. They've increased the strength of this new product by 7 times. In business news, we're having a conversation about this earlier, by the way. We'll come back to it, I'm sure. The stock value of Gamestop has soared more than 300% in the past week, with the price at the moment of writing standing at $347. GameStop has jumped by a total of as much as 1,700%. That's 18 times, if I'm doing my math right, in the last 2 weeks. Fund investors who are shorting the stock have lost billions. And again, we were talking about this for almost half an hour. Go back to about 8:20 Eastern. We started talking about this and we continued that conversation with Maram Susli. Boeing president and CEO Dave Calhoun revealed to company employees on Wednesday that the Boeing 777X jetliner, originally slated to debut in 2019, will not be released until late 2023 due to multiple factors, including, quote, an updated assessment of global certification requirements, our latest assessment of COVID-19 impacts on market demand, and discussions with customers with respect to aircraft delivery timing, end quote. And with that, you're listening to Fault Lines. Those are our headlines on Fault Lines. And we're going into a break. We'll be back in just a minute with our next guest, Laith Marouf. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan. Be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Great job. Even better. Let's get one more, just to be sure.
Are you a young photographer the world needs to know? Bring your images to more eyes through the Andre Stenin contest. Open to both artists and photojournalists, there are dozens of categories to enter and compete for a share of serious prize money. And, more importantly, international recognition of your work. Learn more about how to enter at stenincontest.com. Point, shoot, win.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us the like and share that audio and video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. But joining us is award-winning multimedia producer and broadcast law consultant, Laith Marouf. Laith, welcome to the show, man. I always enjoy when you come on. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. There is an interesting question that has come up that I am more than enamored by, and it's the JCPOA. Now, I have this question from the standpoint of Europe, meaning when we had a gentleman on, I forget who it was, but we were having this conversation about the EU. I think it was, it'll come to me. But we were having a conversation on the EU. And one of the areas I wanted to get into is this notion of how the EU wasn't able to protect Iran after the U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA by itself. Now, all things being equal, the other countries that signed on to the JCPOA didn't do it for the U.S. They did it for both parties. Meaning if one party backed out of the deal, if one party repudiated the deal, then that party's at fault. And you would think that the EU, Europe, and all of the other signers of this would basically point the finger at America and say, it's your fault. You pull out of the JCPOA. It's you're the one that calls for breaking this agreement. But that's not what the EU did. And more importantly, the EU wasn't able necessarily to defend Iran in the way that they were supposed to do so under the idea of this particular, well, it wasn't a treaty, but under this particular deal. Going forward with Joe Biden, I guess one question is Europe going to put any measure in place to continue to protect Iran? Is Europe going to lobby to try to get Biden back to the JCPOA? And for that matter, would Iran even go back to the JCPOA, considering the next group that may take power might be a hardliner, but as a response to Trump? Please respond or explain.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, Europe has been practically occupied by the United States since the end of World War II. There is some, small amount of independence that these countries have, but once they decide to do something in contradiction of dictates of the United States, say, if you remember Macron in France, the president of France, who refused to join the war on Iraq, and we saw how France was punished for that. So in reality, the European governments were, the carrot in this nuclear deal, because to Iran, trade with the EU is much more important than trade with the United States. So Iran was enticed to come into the treaty by offering it to have normal trade with Europe. And what happened is that normal trade never occurred, actually. And in fact, Europe colluded with the United States once Trump added all these extra sanctions that he piled on, and supported in terms of at least not allowed the trade to happen under these extra sanctions. So I don't expect the EU to pressure Biden to do anything. I expect the other way around, that Biden will whip them into line just like Trump did.
That's unfortunate. So what does that mean for the JCPOA? And would Iran go back to it if Biden offered to? I mean, considering the way Trump pulled out of that unilaterally, an issue of trust has to be a part of that process, meaning if Biden, let's say if Biden runs 2 years, let's say he lasts for 2 years, and he does what he says he's going to do. I'm going to be the transition candidate for the next generation of neoliberal to take office and bomb people. If that is the case and she loses, she could bring in another Republican, which means within 4 years, the policy could be back to some kind of weird against the world stance. So from that standpoint, I guess, is Biden going to go back to the JCPOA, and would Iran be open to him if he did? And I heard Rouhani keeps saying, or I heard Rouhani say yes, but that's stunning that he's saying yes in and of itself. But what's the reality of this?
Yeah, I mean, we just heard, yesterday, Blinken, the new Secretary of State of the United States, saying that they are not in a hurry to get back to the nuclear deal, that he expects Iran to comply with all its duties within the treaty before they even return themselves and or lift the sanctions that were imposed outside the treaty on top of it. So,
right there,
we have.
Wait, real quick. Is Iran going to accept that? Like, that's what I mean. That it's so outside of context. Like, Donald Trump was the one to pull out of the JCPOA. Donald Trump was the one that murdered Soleimani. Donald Trump was the one that knocked that thing out of the sky, meaning us. He was working in the capacity of the president of the United States. And in doing all of these things, the assassinations, the killings, the ramping up, everything else, it started with us pulling out of the deal. For Biden to take the position that, you have to make additional concessions for us to even think about it. That's astonishing. That's an astonishing position. And not shocked, by the way. Would they even accept that?
And that's also that's imperial hubris, okay? And it's clear Iran passed, their parliament passed a resolution stating that if the United States doesn't return to the treaty fully and lift all the sanctions fully by February 21st, meaning a month after the inauguration of Biden, that they will raise the enrichment of the uranium up to probably 60%, and that they will pull out of the extra protocols, the additional protocols of the International Atomic Agency, which means that there will be no more sudden surprise inspections and by the United Nations of the Iranian nuclear sites. And so what we have right now is it's clear Iran had lived through the negotiations. It cannot trust anymore neither the United States nor the weak, obedient EU powers who are vessels of the United States. And it must protect itself, and it must prepare itself for an eventual, probably, attack. So we're at that stage, and this is, yesterday Putin, the president of Russia, said that we are at a stage that is very similar to the few days just preceding World War II.
So, you know what? I was going to ask you about the EU, but that is significant. What you were saying there at the very end is significant. If in what ways does the current moment compare? What are the parallels that you see, Laith?
So you remember, look, and this is not to equate the United States with Nazis, but the reason the World War II started was that Germany was expanding, and it was occupying one country at a time outside any international law and at the time the League of Nations. And so, the first couple of countries that were occupied by Germany, nobody did anything, and that emboldened it to continue in its invasions of countries, and that eventually triggered the war by the other parties, the major powers in the world. And so the United States has been expanding since the fall of the Soviet Union and did not have any opposition that could actually fight it back. It had taken, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, Somalia, and it was piling up. And where the expansion of the United States as an imperial power was put to a halt was in Syria. And we got to a very close situation of direct confrontation between the Russians and the American forces. But now we have a possible war on Iran, and Iran is not a small country, and Iran is a arms producer that doesn't need arms supplies from outside it to protect itself. And any war on Iran would mean a disruption of the whole flow of goods in the world, and above and beyond the flow of oil and gas to the big markets. And that in itself will definitely trigger a involvement by China and Russia, and then it will be impossible to stop the snowball from becoming a world war.
So let's turn to the EU for a minute. You were saying that they're effectively vassals of the United States, that they're weak, that they wouldn't defy what the U.S. wants them to do. But it seems like the Trump administration drove a wedge that has increasingly divided the EU from Washington. And it seems like that will follow through, at least to some extent, into the Biden administration. No matter how much he tries to resolve those differences, no matter how much he tries to bring them back into the fold, they went ahead with the investment deal with China. Admittedly, there's a lot of them at stake there economically, so it makes sense that they would want to do that. But they, in the process, of course, they defied what Pompeo's State Department wanted them to do. They defied what Washington wanted them to do. And that is seen by many, including myself, as a sign that they're increasingly striving for independence, albeit one led arguably more by Macron this time than Merkel, who seems to have taken a step back. Do you not see that? Do you think that it applies? What do you think is actually going on there? Do you see them as still effectively subservient? Or what's your take, Laith?
Yeah, they are, effectively subservient to the United States. And I would say, the difference between right now European states and the United States is the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. They both agree that, the West is the best. They just don't agree on how to make everybody who is not from the West to say that loudly, okay, and forcefully. So some, Europeans and or the Democrats in the United States think that if you give enough carrots to people in Africa and South America and Asia, that we'll all, bend over and admit that the West is the best. And some others believe that, no, you got to beat the shit out of people. And I'm sorry, I swore there. To beat the hell out of people.
You can't say that. You can go back into it, of course. But no, you're good. It's just the radio. But go ahead, man.
Yeah. So, so that is the real difference. And, if you look at Europe, really, the European Union is two countries right now. It's France and Germany, and everybody else follows in suit within that. And there is a consensus, and the consensus is Western supremacy.
We need to go into a break. Yeah. We're going to come back to continue these conversations. We are joined by Laith Marouf. He's an award-winning multimedia producer and broadcasting law consultant who you can follow on Twitter at Laith Marouf and check out the website he's a part of, cmacenter.org. And that is center, C-E-N-T-R-E, not T-E-R. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but we'll be back in one short minute.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is guest, friend of the show, Laith Marouf, an award-winning multimedia producer and broadcast law consultant. And again, Laith, welcome back to the show. You mentioned something in the last break that I thought was rather profound. You said it was being the enrichment was going to go up to 60%. Now, from my point of view, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, there's been a sense of brinksmanship that has been taking place in the U.S., at the very least during the Trump administration. It was understood that Donald Trump didn't want a war. And because it was understood that Donald Trump didn't want a war, Iran certainly didn't want a war, then the brinksmanship revolved around this idea of avoiding war while going up to the line where you don't want to cross. It was a very weird back and forth, but you would have a situation where, let's say, they pull out a JCPOA and send a drone over their heads. It's shot down. And then, so what does Trump do? Now, what would Trump do under normal circumstances? And if Trump takes provocative action, what is Iran's response going to do? Meaning, Trump pulled back from a response that would have put him in a situation where his options were off the table, where every option at that point became the opposition's. And so it seems that they went back and forth on this, both realizing that neither wanted a war and both willing to go up to the line, pushing it, knowing that they don't. I was fascinated by this. This is kind of odd asymmetrical warfare in the way that these guys engaging in this event. But Biden is in now. And whereas that predilection against war was there for Trump, especially from the standpoint of foreign powers, that is not necessarily there for Joe Biden. So when you're saying they're upping it by 60%, is that brinksmanship or is that movement to enrich? Meaning, is this an impetus? Is this kind of a push, a political pressure to bring people, the U.S., back to the deal of the JCPOA? And will this work in the way that they're thinking about it working? Meaning, I think Iran is basically saying, I'm going to reduce this when you get rid of the sanctions. And having at 60% allows more leeway to do it. Or it would get worse if you guys continue to mess around with the sanctions. Am I wrong in that? Like, could you extend on that or correct me when I'm wrong?
Yeah, so the United States, through President Trump, added all these layers and layers of sanctions in contradiction of the nuclear deal. And so the reason that we heard right now that happened is that the United States wants to renegotiate the deal and add all these extra conditions on Iran, and therefore they added all these layers of sanctions to give themselves chips on the table. And so here you have Iran following up with actual moves that give them chips on the table. So let's say there is the sanctions on the banks of Iran. Well, that could be neutralized, or Iran can give an exchange of lifting that, lowering some of the enrichment of uranium that they have reached back to. So Iran, it's in their interest to add more and more moves that can be negotiated in return for lifting some of those extra sanctions and conditions that were put by Trump. Now, as we look at the situation, and given that Biden and Blinken don't want to look like they are the weak party by returning to the deal without, questioning Iran or changing anything in the deal, they're stuck in a situation where they're actually harming their own interests by attempting to look like that they are in control of the situation or they have the upper hand. Iran has already lived 4 years of maximum pressure sanctions. Its economy has adjusted to it. It created more deals. It has escaped the financial controls of the American-dominated system. It has trade with China and Russia and other countries outside that framework. So Iran really, there's nothing that the United States can do now to pressure it. And if the United States doesn't want to return to the deal without gaining anything from Iran, nobody's going to return to the deal.
Well, and this comes as, Biden's administration has already very clearly signaled what tack it's going to take. When Lindsey Graham was questioning incoming Secretary of State Blinken about his position on these issues, Blinken basically reiterated Pompeo by calling Iran the world's leading terror supporter. So they have clearly drawn their own line in terms of where they're going to fall on these issues. If the United States is pushing for concessions, which Iran will not give on the JCPOA, if they're trying to extract those concessions effectively, what is going to happen, just in a broad sense, and I want to come back to this, what is going to happen to the deal itself? What's going to happen to that relationship? What would it take to bring everybody to the table, realistically?
So yesterday, Biden did what Trump did, which he sent in 2 B-52 nuclear bombers, and they flew on the borders of Iran and Syria and Yemen. So what we thought was just a move by Trump that's not going to be repeated when Biden came, it was used already. And we see that really all the rhetoric that Biden and his team and the establishment Democrats were saying in terms of criticism of Trump and his dealings with Iran and the whole region, they were really happy that he was doing this. They have the freedom to continue with the failed policies of Trump without being responsible for them coming into effect, and the unjust policies, the breaches of international law. Because, the JCPOA was ratified at the Security Council of the United Nations, meaning that this is actually, even though it wasn't ratified by the Congress, it is international law and has been set at the Security Council, the highest governing body internationally in the world. So we're right now at a situation where the United States, kind of cornered itself. And when I say the United States, I mean the establishment in the United States, and they cornered themselves in a situation where they either have to back down and submit to international law, which will be another indicator of retreat of imperial power, and or they have to go into a suicidal war. Any attack on Iran by any regional vessel from apartheid Israel or the United Arab Emirates or Saudi-occupied Arabia, and or by the American army itself, will be a devastating for all American presence in the region, and may, as Putin has pointed out, lead us to a world war.
Yeah, I don't know if it looks more like World War II or World War I, where you have these kind of series of allegiances, these series of deals that people and the various countries have in order to use for their own protection. And one country gets into a war, and then everybody gets into a war because of the agreements and allegiances. And keep in mind, that started with Austro-Hungarian Empire, Serbia, basically, where they wanted to teach Serbia a lesson because they wanted to attack Serbia before Serbia got to the point of being able to basically be a peer or stand up to them. And just like Bush going into Iraq, Austro-Hungarian Empire did the exact same thing, basically saying, here are the things, here's what we need to make the situation right. And of course, there were things that no government could attend to, and that being the provocation for war. I guess I'm making the point that Bush got us into Iraq with basically, this lie in order to go in with the whole weapons of mass destruction stuff. It was basically predicated on a lie. And the agreements and alliances that we seem to have, they seem to be breaking into spheres, just like it was then. With, let's say, China, Russia, Iran, Syria, North Korea, you might even get Turkey. And then the other side. I do think this is problematic in regards to the tension that is there from a foreign policy standpoint. And that does give me concern. It did give me qualms. I'm curious, what is the perspective of the people in Iran about this? What do they want? What is, if you could take a poll, just talking to the various people, not necessarily in government, but just the public itself, how would they want all of this to resolve? I know getting rid of the sanctions, I know that part, but what is their point of view in regards to government and in regards to forces outside of the country itself?
Well, people in Iran, you saw when the assassination of General Soleimani happened last year in January, there was almost 40 million people out in the streets. It was the largest funeral procession in recorded human history. So we know clearly from that the Iranian people want their right to feel equal to others, and they want their government to stand up to any aggressor. What I expect is that, in the upcoming parliamentary elections in Iran, that will be asserted through electing the conservatives or the more hardliners. And it's a very big possibility that this is the last term of Rouhani and his team, who tried to negotiate with the West an equitable way to having normal relations, and failed because the West, led by the United States and Europe, failed to deliver on their obligations. And so I think that most Iranians are just like the rest of the humanity. Everybody just wants to have dignity and respect for their way of life. Most people don't want to force their way of life on others. Unfortunately, the West believes that its way of life is supreme, it's superior, and everybody has to either accept that or be beaten into it. And, it's very similar to how the Wahhabis and the death squads that Saudi Arabia exports, and or how Israel is treating the Palestinians. It's a way of saying, this is the way, or you're not even human. And so we are at this stage where there is a lot of glitches in the matrix. Everything that the United States is doing and the West is only exposing the contradictions in their propaganda and or the self-image that they like to portray to the rest of the world.
The voice you guys were listening to is Laith Marouf, an award-winning multimedia producer and broadcasting law consultant. You can follow Laith on Twitter at Laith Marouf, that's LaithMarouf, and his website, cmacenter.org. Shane, thank you for joining us, Laith. Shane, he makes a really good point. And, this gets back to the whole thing about, is propaganda needed in a society? And I think your point is true, that the further away you get from this idea of honesty or its stated value, like this is who we are and we're living up to it, then that differential between who you are versus who you say you are has to be minded by something. You have to close that gap somehow in dealing with the public, and I think propaganda is the way you deal with it. So yeah, you're right. It can't be expanded to just include everything. It has to be specific in its intent. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with Shane's The Wrap.
Fault Fault lines.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back and we're taking calls. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan. And this is our open call-in segment. Like Jamarl said, it is the wrap. We're wrapping up our show today. And we're inviting you to join us as we do so. 202-521-1320 is the number. Again, in long form, that's 202-521-1320. And I do believe we have a caller, Tarif. Thank you for the call. Calling in from New Orleans. How are you doing this morning and what's on your mind?
All right, like they said, they got the thing called woke. That was actually fake. You got this world awakening taking place, right? I remember listening to Jordan Maxwell last year. I take some of this stuff as a grain of salt. He's supposed to be part psychic or whatnot. But I remember he came up and said something about the end of this year of 2021 going to 22. You would see a turn, like people get upset with the rich, with the wealthy, with the billionaires. And it seems like because what happened with Trump being banned, and now they banned that server group, Wall Street Bet, and they got the rest of that dude in Florida for making those memes, people start waking up. Now you got in the lexicon that's going throughout the internet, agent provocateur, COINTELPRO, ban, and also how to fight back by using their own system against them by saving brick and mortar stores like AMC, Bath and Body Works, and Gamestop, and the other one. And now the Wall Street want to change the rules, and they asking for these hedge funds to be bailed out now, which is going to be our tax money. So as time goes on, basically like LaRouche said, people are going to see how the things operate, and they're going to counteract this. So they're going to make all the regulations to keep themselves in power. But remember this, but there's more of us than them. So this is the real Occupy Wall Street right now, using their own system against them. So you're going to use it against us? Well, okay, we're going to show you we're human beings too. We can think too. I wish I would have bought stock into GameStop. That would have been happy. But
you would have made a lot of money in a very short period of time. I will put it like that. If you were one of the early adopters of this, if you bought it when it was worth $20 a share, this morning it's up to what, 360, and it seems set to go higher. I mean, here's the thing though, Tarif, and I want to hand it back over to you because I'm curious about your response. They have very quickly come in with their sort of standard messaging here, which is hate speech. These are white supremacists. They're Trump supporters in some cases, and we should ban them because of that. And I'm worried that it's not going to be too long from now that, this is already fitting into our narrative about like domestic terrorism at home and misinformation online and extremists agitating and organizing online, all that stuff. How do you respond to that messaging? If you're somebody who genuinely does not, as the vast majority of folks, I'm sure in the movement and outside of it, you don't care for some of what some people said, but you're like, hey, it's ridiculous that we should be bailing these hedge funds out just because they decided to bet against these brick and mortar companies, and they failed because of this sort of random internet uprising against them. How do you respond to the messaging? What do you do if people are suddenly calling you racist or whatever because they've managed to do this jujitsu and make it about something that it's completely unrelated? Tarif, what's your take?
Okay, this is what you have to do. First of all, they're cutting out the lines of communication, just like old boy said last night on Tucker Carlson show that's on Fox News. So they have to build their own servers now, and probably outside the country, maybe put them in Mexico, because it seems like AMLO is for freedom of speech. Now, thank God for Putin and AMLO. Hopefully at the G20, they're going to come up with something to counteract this American soft power dealing with Twitter and Facebook. So you build your own servers, probably outside the country. You use the wildcat strike to push for Medicare care for all, and also to bring the troops on to end poverty, to end homelessness, right? And you use those tactics. Also, if you got to take your money out the banks, if these banks is putting the money into hedge fund and speculation, which is actually going against us, these brick and mortar stores. So you make an example off of one bank. Okay, so you want to go, you want to invest in these hedge funds? Okay, we're gonna start taking our money out the bank. So you let them know, look, there's a way to this. You just don't. We can't roll over us like this. You know what I'm saying? There's more of us than you, so we're gonna use our mind. We're not gonna get in the street and throw bricks and bust windows. We're gonna use our mind and sit at home and think and read and do things lawfully. Then we're gonna expose you by you changing the laws. Then people are gonna wake up even more. So then over time, you're gonna see things gonna change. It's gonna benefit, and it's gonna benefit us and the rest of humanity. Watch what I tell you. That's all I got.
Tarif, I love that perspective. Thank you for the call. We got more calls. Jamarl, before we move on to our next caller, still taking calls, by the way, 202-521-1320. Jamarl, what do you think? You there, man?
Well, the problem is 80% of the stocks are owned by like the top 10%. And so basically the people who are in the market are the people with means. Most of the public itself doesn't own stocks. So it's like the pull your stocks out that's not a message for us. That's a message for them, per se.
Look at this. I mean, but...
Well, don't get me wrong. This is different. But that's kind of where I was going with this. This kind of is different. That's why this is such an anomaly. You have the public itself that has decided, hey, we can lump in and we can actually buy stock also, and we can move the market. This is awesome. This is phenomenal. But I'm making the point that the majority of investors are not these guys, if that makes sense. Like, it's the money that is in the market. Like, these guys, yes, they were able to move it because they were able to put so much emphasis into one or, a few stocks. But I don't know if that's the norm. Like, this is not, usually it's the hedge fund and the people of means. I love this. And personally, I would argue pretty much every American that has two nickels to rub together should also probably be investing, because this is a great idea. Join Robinhood, join whatever these other groups are, and make your voice known. So, but this is going to collapse. This thing is going to drop like 90% at some point. And there are going to be some people who lose their shirts, unfortunately. So, yes, but beware, I guess. And can I even say yes if I don't necessarily want to be anywhere near the stock when that thing implodes? But I feel you. I mean, like I said, I'm not entirely against what Tarif is saying. I think he's, he often gives these hopeful messages, and I appreciate it. But we have... Yeah,
no, it's hopeful, but at the end, frankly, I mean, he was talking about educating yourself on a fundamental level, reading books, improving the quality of information that you take in. It's always a good place to start. Of course, that's not where you end, but that's not what he was advocating. Anyway, Tarif agreed completely on that. We got more callers. We have Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hey, what's going on, guys? I think Tarif was pretty much dead on. I personally, I have not really been on Reddit as much. I have an account, but I've not been on as much. I haven't paid as much attention, and I wish I had. But beyond that, I'm glad to see the fight advancing in this way, because it's not so much about this stock alone or the sustainability of this stock. It's more about the action that was taken and the flare that gets sent up as a result. And I hope this continues. And in other ways, other forms of the fight, other methods. I'm not sure what formations those will take on, but just any form of the people being able to strike a blow back at the powers that be. Because as Kim Iverson said in her video, and she has been saying, this is scary how they're cracking down on social media and the internet. So we will have to find different ways of attacking it. If you're looking at a battle, you're looking at a war fighter. This is the same way they taught us to fight so-called terrorists when I was preparing to go downrange. It's the same thing, because you're not fighting a standard war. So you have to learn different tactics. And just to see the people still actually putting in work and coming up with different ideas and coming together, I'm really happy to see that, because I was really worried that Joe Biden would introduce everybody going back to sleep. And I'll leave it there.
Brave, that's my fear too. That's my fear too. Like, everybody just goes back to sleep the moment Joe Biden gets in. And it's like, oh, we're fighting Trump. And then you get half of, the people with even some semblance of the left basically go to bed because Joe Biden is doing it, and he's going to run steady hand and that stuff. I want to point something out too. That's awesome. Do you realize that Robinhood has stopped serving AMC, BlackBerry, and Nokia? You can sell your positions. Users can close out positions, but they can't buy any more of those stocks. That's amazing.
And what Tarif was talking about with people coming up with alternatives, for instance, to social media companies, hopefully it doesn't stop there, because again, Robinhood has now counted themselves amongst the ranks of those tech companies that would do the bidding of the political establishment, despite it going against the best interests, the best intentions, and what their users want, to put it very simply. So ironic for an app named Robinhood to suddenly turn coat like this. I'm not bought into these stocks. I don't really care. It's not my personal thing. But as a sort of social movement, as a call and a response, as the Hegelian dialectic, kind of abstruse topic to be bringing up, but some people associate that with, you do something, you see what your opposition does, you sort of create an oppositional response, and then you respond to that, you synthesize it, and it creates a new situation. You do it too. People on the streets are doing it too. They're acting. The establishment is reacting. And on the other side of that reaction, a lot more comes to light. Now, when it comes to what you were right at the end there, you were talking about how you were worried that people would be going to sleep during a Biden administration and not pushing back against him because they were so tired of Trump and they were so happy to cling on to him as a response to Trump. I think enough people are worried about that we are not really seeing that happen. Maybe in the MSNBC crowd, but they were already in that narrative anyway. At this point, what I see is a lot of people pushing back on the establishment still, and in a lot of cases pushing back on Biden too. Because they were worried that exactly that thing would happen. So thankfully, I don't think we are there. We have another caller, though. I think we should go to him. Calling in now, we have Ben from Ohio. Ben, you're on. What's on your mind, Ben?
Hey, how are you?
All right. How are you, man?
I'm doing all right. One, I can just say I absolutely love how basically Reddit was like the Joker, basically saying, don't worry, I'm only burning my half, and then just setting everything on fire. I absolutely love it. It brings a smile to my face. And I'm pretty sure, I haven't heard anything from him, but I'm pretty sure it would bring like a smile to like Bernie Sanders' face too, because like basically average working people are literally seizing the means of production, and the establishment just can't have it. That's literally what's happening. It's a democratic, people are just like, oh, well, I just don't want to sell it. I just want to hold on to it. And it's causing everyone to lose their minds. And I am curious to know, like, what the rule is, because someone who isn't me may have made like a couple $100 off of this, but people are just talking publicly. It's not like insider trading. They're literally just saying, hey, these are some things I've noticed. This is what I did. What do you think? And it's just being multiplied like 1 million times, or 200, or how many people are on that subreddit. How do you, there's no crime there that I can see. So I don't know. I wanted you guys' opinion.
No, there is no crime there. Like I said, my wife plays around with Robinhood. There's another one like penny stocks and stuff like that. And all of the people just come together and talk. They're just, people who play the market. And in those conversations, they come up with ideas for stocks. And oftentimes you would have a lot of people pointing to one. That one often does well. That's not illegal by any stretch. And I don't see how that's different than anything that these guys are doing on Wall Street. If not, in fact, least worse than that. Market. Yeah, because they have insider trading, they have authority, power, all that stuff, not to mention political leaders to respond to these guys. So yeah, they're worse than the people in the Robinhood in those chats. Those people are not breaking the law. They're just using the system that's available to them to make ends, and some groups don't like it.
No, don't. One, people are freaking. The reason the establishment, the financial establishment, is freaking out about this is, one, they're facing immediate economic losses, and two, they see the power being taken from their hands. They see the reins being picked up by members of the public. That means they are losing their supremacy in some sense. And if this continues, I'm sure that will deepen, because this will become not just a momentary thing, but a long-term tactic of larger groups of people who are not just trying to make money, but again, are trying to specifically disembowel the hedge funds, the big financial centers of power. And of course, what this is also going to bring to light politically is you're going to see the extent of influence that those hedge funds have over our government as our government decides how it's going to respond as members of Congress start to speak up. Back to that. This is a very interesting story. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back tomorrow, folks. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.
That is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one is in the record books. LOL, out loud, big time, at disembowel hedge funds. That is the funniest thing ever. And the billionaire tears, basically, the crying on CNBC about the money that they lost, billions. They decided to take positions, gutting those companies with the idea of we're going to attack these companies. We're going to go after these retail stores. Now, the retail was already in a precarious spot and more precarious by COVID. And so these guys thought the people at the various things were slim or perfect pickings. Nobody had an issue with them going after GameStop. Nobody had an issue with them putting, billions or how much ever they were putting into the shorting the stock. In fact, the overwhelming people who were buying that stock were short sellers. And so it's like, how are you getting mad that people are basically buying a stock that you were short selling? If you have the right to short sell it, they damn sure have a right to buy it. Their reasoning for buy it doesn't matter. That doesn't matter at all. If they want to buy the stock, they should be able to buy the stock. You have people in Congress who do it. No issue. Loeffler, Perdue, no issue with that. Nancy Pelosi's husband spent like $1 million in climate, in Tesla. Who do you think is going to benefit from the legislation that Nancy Pelosi passes? Her and her husband. Because if it's anything to do with green tech and anything to do with batteries and anything to do with charging stations that are going to proliferate through the United States, understand that one of the hedges to electric vehicles is infrastructure. Meaning, think of all the gas stations that we have across the United States. How long did it take to put those gas stations in? And what does it mean when you have that much infrastructure from the standpoint of oil and gas? When you're trying to switch to something else. Meaning, if I'm trying to switch to electricity, how difficult is it for me to do it? And is it something that private enterprise in and of itself can pull off? Private enterprise didn't build these roads, and you have this situation that these guys are going to be begging for cash to do just that. I guess the point that I'm making here is Tesla can only expand in this administration. And if Pelosi, who is going to be instrumental in passing that legislation, if it is indeed passed, and appropriating where that money goes, if it is indeed appropriated, will make tons of cash off of it. Is that fair? Think about what I'm saying. Somebody who's on the inside, who knows legislation that's coming through, who has all sorts of people who can give them assessments on what that's going to look like, far more than the public. Even if it's not explicitly insider trading, doesn't necessarily mean that they're not using information that most of the public, let's say, don't have access to, or that the way it's explained and the way it's articulated to them is far more succinct and far more informative than, let's say, many of the public will have at their disposal. And making the point that that is also a certain manipulation of the market by people in the political class. But yeah, a person goes on and says, hey, we're shorting this stock. Everybody, can you hear we're shorting this stock? The moment that a big hedge fund says that, what happens? The stock often goes down. And at that point, you may even get a feeding frenzy with these guys basically going on, shorting the stock, and then dumping it. Yeah, you get no leeway from me on the Wall Street bet stuff. Those people were perfectly in their right to do what they did. And it's bullshit that they're going to shut them down and then turn around and say, oh, this had nothing to do with the bets. There was just some bad language on the site. There are 2 million people on the site. 2 million people. How do you police 2 million people? You tell me. You have a Reddit group. You have all of these people in the particular group, and all of these people are cursing. If you knew where the curses were, can't you just take those out? And let's say it's somewhat hateful speech and everything else. Again, how do you police 2 million people? And for some level of hateful speech in it, do you get rid of the entirety of the site? It just seems so extreme. And I suspect that the extremeness of it had to do with the hysteria and basically the billionaire tears on CNBC. These guys did nothing wrong. God bless you. Yeah, God bless. I'm going to say like. I'm going to say share. I'm going to say subscribe. I am up and at 'em. I haven't been to bed yet. Couldn't sleep. And so on those days, I tend to be kind of awake. So you're going to see me probably in the next 30 minutes. And let's get some shows in. Let's do the news. Like, share, and subscribe.